the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter or X and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. May I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that their electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones or everything goes a little bit weird. So the quorum for this meeting has not been achieved, meaning this meeting will now take place informally. That makes no difference to all of you, so don't worry about that, guests. Thank you. We will not take formal decisions or agree the committee's minutes for the 28th of November 2023, which are included in the published agenda. These will be deferred to the next formal meeting, and I'm happy to take any inquiries about these at this item of business. For transparency, we will still declare any interests, and we are also able to note items. So today we're holding an investigation on crime and planning. So before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I ask our committee officer Jack Booth to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence, but in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Deputy Chairman Assembly Member Peter Fortune will be attending the meeting remotely.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Thank you. As mentioned, we are unable to agree the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 28th of November 2023 until we can. Do anyone have any comments? No. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? Noted. Some noise would be great. And can we note the response from the Mayor of London to the committee's letter on the Affordable Housing and Development Viability London Plan Guidance Consultation? Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, a discussion on how the potential for crime and antisocial behaviour can be reduced through the design of the built environment, with the aim of identifying key priorities in this area for a future review of the London Plan. So we're holding two separate panel discussions, and I would like to welcome, finally, our first panel of guests in the chamber. Thank you for your patience. So we have Guy Ferguson, who's Chief Executive Officer at Police Crime Prevention Initiatives, CPI. We have Dr. Elanor Warwick, who is Head of Strategic Policy, Evidence and Research at Clarion Housing Group, and you're attending this meeting in your capacity as the author of Defensible Space on the Move, Mobilisation in English Housing Policy in Practice. Thank you. Phineas Harper, Chief Executive Officer at the Open City, and Russell Curtis, Founding Director of RCKA Architects. Got everyone right? And attending online, we have David Lucy, who's the Designing Out Crime Officer for the Metropolitan Police Service, and Martin Hubbard, the Designing Out Crime Officer, also for the Metropolitan Police Service. Thank you. Who I hope are here. I hope are here. They are online, they're just not quite visible yet. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first few questions. So my first questions are to Guy and also David and Martin. So I think I'll come to Guy, you first. So can I ask if you feel that police interventions in the planning process are helping to reduce crime?
I would absolutely agree that they are. Certainly the evidence that we've seen from the implementation of Secured by Design and Secured by Design Gold in particular would suggest that from the academic research that we've done, between 60 and 87% you're less likely to be the victim of a burglary. And we are collating some more evidence around that at the moment, and hopefully that will get published within the next few months, as we've commissioned a collation of that evidence to be pulled together from UCL around that. But that's looking across the 30-year history of Secure by Design, where it's made that major impact. It is probably worth saying that whilst we obviously very much welcome the Part Q aspect of contribution, that Secure by Design Gold makes a massive more difference in terms of looking at not just the actual physical structure of the buildings, but also the surroundings of that. And I think that investment in that would bear great thought for further planning initiatives to focus on that, because it doesn't cost very much to do it on top of what you're putting on for Park Q. Actually, the cost is minimal, really, in a view of the actual benefits you get from it. And it's not just the benefits directly in relation to burglary, which is obviously the one that one looks at, but the wider community impact of that. So things like antisocial behaviour, it impacts on that. It also impacts on criminal damage and vehicle crime, but it also, if you think about it more in a wider sense about the impact it could have on community cohesion, I think it would be fairly accepted that people feel less safe in their homes if they've been burgled, and are therefore more likely to move, and therefore that community cohesion can be impacted. It also has positive impact around the carbon cost of crime, I think. But if you just think about it, we had some research done by the University of Surrey a few years ago, looking at the carbon cost of crime, and just simply vehicles coming to and from to report it, the repairs that are necessary, and all of that. So we would, and I would say this is the CEO of the organisation, the not-for-profit organisation that focuses on and has Secure by Design as one of our initiatives. I would very much commend it to the Assembly and the panel.
Thank you. Thanks very much for starting us off. David and Martin, I wonder if we could have the MPS's view of this.
Yes, certainly. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for inviting us here today. For us at the Metropolitan Police Service, Secure by Design is a scheme that really works. There's the academic research there which proves that it works on an academic level. But in real life scenarios, in the real life on the ground, when we're working with architects, developers, and local authority planners, we see these buildings being built, and we see how safe they are, and we see how low levels of ASB and crime we have within a secured by design development versus a non-secured by design development. And all the partners that we work with believe in it, and they're really engaged in it. In the 6 years that I've been doing this, we've gone from being not being written in local plans to now being written into local plans, area action plans, supplementary planning documents. Our partners in local authorities, social housing providers really believe in this on a number of levels, reducing crime, antisocial behaviour, community cohesion within these residential and business areas, and really reducing that crime and reducing the demand on the MPSs, which is one part of why we're doing this. We've got the MPS has invested in this. We've got a big team of design and crime officers that work across all 32 London boroughs, and we're seeing a real difference being made not only to the new built environment, but actually what the stat then does is creates an expertise in design and crime that we have. So where we have existing crime problems in existing built-up areas, we're able to use that expertise to make changes to that built environment. And again, when we do that to existing built environments, we see real change in that built environment.
Thanks, David. That's really helpful. I don't know whether it's possible for you to put your camera on. I know my hearing isn't brilliant, so it's helpful for me to actually see. If you can't, I understand. And Martin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I would, Ma'am. Apologies about the voice. It's gradually going. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but we do understand that you may be briefer because of your voice. Thank you.
Yeah. The face is not much better than the voice, I'm afraid, Ma'am. What I would add to that, what David has said there, is the fact that our involvement is not just about ensuring that we have safer and more secure developments in future, Sometimes it's also very important to prevent substandard developments coming online, which in effect will be unsafe and will have higher levels of crime going forward, and which will cost local authorities and the taxpayer far more in future in terms of crime rates, repairs, recorded crime, dissatisfied tenants and residents. So there is the positive aspect of our work, where we're trying to develop and deliver safer new developments. But also there is another aspect where we're trying to prevent substandard developments going in. We don't want to see a repeat of many of the problem estates over many years. If we can get in at the design and planning stage and ensure that we can deliver safer places, that is a greater benefit for all Londoners going forward.
Thanks. Thank you very much. For the rest of the panel, do you have anything to add at this stage? Obviously, we'll have plenty of time to add at a later stage. Russell.
May I speak?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, I'm slightly troubled by some of those comments. I don't think it's sensible to look at secure by design in isolation. Research that shows that the carbon cost or the carbon reduction of secure by design cannot be assessed alone without looking at some of the other impacts. So, for example, secure by design advocates for cul-de-sacs rather than streets. And that will definitely have a greater impact on the environment in terms of vehicle movements, more dependency upon cars, increased delivery distances, all that sort of thing. And so I haven't seen the research that's been referred to, but I would be I would imagine that it isn't taking that into account. I'm happy to be disproven on that, but you cannot look at these things alone. I think also with community cohesion, we can certainly talk about the impact of antisocial behaviour, in particular in public open space within developments, and the the positive impact that secure by design has in that regard. But that doesn't take into account things like mental and physical well-being, community cohesion in the occupation of open space, and some of the things that secure by design advocates, I think, are diametrically opposed to the positive experience of many residents in the use of open space. So I think there are certain, we cannot look at it in isolation without understanding those things too. It does occupy a slightly strange position in that there is a building regulations Part Q, which covers basically windows and doors, how easy it is to break into a dwelling, which secure by design enhances. But I think the secure by design guidance around design, around the layout of development, the layout of dwellings, should sit within planning policy. I don't think it's necessary that it sits within a separate piece of guidance. So I would sort of wonder whether it has as much value, perhaps, as we think it does in that respect.
Thanks, Russell. And we will definitely come back to some of the critiques as well. But thank you for putting that up front. Does anyone else have anything to this stage?
Well, just maybe we'll be able to talk about this more, but like Russell, I was troubled by some of that evidence. The architects, landscape architects, property developers, and even engineers that I know tell me that secure by design is really bad and often leads to negative outcomes for the communities that they're working with, and is poorly thought through, applied inconsistently, often sort of rooted in quite systemic prejudices, which, of course, the case year review last year revealed were endemic in the Metropolitan Police. And so it is no surprise that when the Met is engaging with urban design, those prejudices are coming through in the kind of design advice that they're giving to London local authorities. So I am one of, I guess, lots of Londoners who are seriously concerned about how much influence this particular institution has over the design of our streets and homes and playgrounds and so forth. And I think we need to ask some serious questions about how the new London plan should change in the light of the case year review, in the light of this never-ending series of stories of profound failures within the Met. You can kind of treat it in two ways. On the one hand, there's the question of like whether the Met is an appropriate and credible organisation to be involved in a conversation about community safety, given those failures and that review. And then you can also look at the actual design guidance, which, you know, some of it is fairly benign, but a lot of it is seriously flawed. And I think if we were to have more built environment professionals on this panel, that view would be very loudly heard.
Thank you. And yes, we will definitely return to the subject again, but I do thank you for putting the view up front at the start of this. So I'm just going to return a bit more to dig into the police interventions and indicators. So are there specific, Guy, you mentioned like a 60% less likely figure around crime. Can you explain what that figure is, and also whether there are other specific metrics or indicators used to measure the success in planning of interventions, specifically around reducing crime?
Yes, I can. I do feel a little bit of a need to respond to the conflation of Casey's report with Secure by Design. I don't understand why that's relevant to this discussion. The Secure by Design scheme has been running with positive impact for over 30 years. To actually draw in some sort of recent bit of criticism about the Met in particular is, I find, kind of irrelevant, really, and I take exception to being hauled in regard to that. I don't see that Elizabeth Casey's report in any way referred to what I see across the board as the excellent work of the designing out crime teams across London. I find that quite difficult to draw that in. And
I don't think we'd like to be setting people against panel members up against each other, so apologies if that's happened. I'm sure that's not the case, but I'm sure you'd understand there are strong feelings about aspects of policing. So really, please do, you know, your evidence will be taken and balanced and everything like that. We're here to hear from a range of voices, but, you know, genuinely, please, we'd like to hear your views, but I'm sure you can understand. We have further questions about community engagement, so there will be a chance to dig into that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that David and Martin will also be able to help
Absolutely.
a bit more around the specifics in that area as well.
Okay. David, Martin, are you able to give any more information around specific metrics or indicators used to measure the success, or in fact whether there are additional metrics that should be collected in order to evaluate the police's role in the planning process?
I think there's lots of academic research to show that the successes of Secure by Design, not to mention what in a subsequent written submission that we could show that actually that the communities that we serve, which I'm passionate about in keeping London as safe as possible, are safer when they're on a secure by design development, and it's national guidance that the MPS are following. It isn't us deciding on a whim what we think keeps people safe. This is proven interventions that keep people safe. So, for example, Glasgow Housing Association, which was, when this research was done, was the largest housing association in Europe at the time, 60% reduction in burglary. University's Huddersfield showed that secure by design versus non-secure by design reduced vehicle crime by 25%, criminal damage by 25%. And actually, a secure by design gold development, Police Scotland showed 87% reduction, and with some academic research done around the same thing over a 25-year period, reducing burglary by 75%. So we are talking about burglary, we're talking about a heinous crime that happens to people, and achieving some significant reductions to that built environment. And that advice is consistent. It's certainly consistent across London that we give, which is why we're able to achieve those reductions following that national guidance And my team work with hundreds of firms of architects across the year and over the years, who really see and value the benefit of secure by design and the benefit that it's doing to their development and the people and businesses that subsequently occupy those, occupy those.
Thank you, and forgive me for not being familiar with this research and some of the stats that you're quoting, and thank you for that. But how much is that able to be assured that there are other? We will come on to this later, but that there aren't other issues affecting the amount of burglary, say, because obviously 60% is a very large figure, and that's done in a way to make sure that this is purely about the design aspects and not anything else.
Yeah, that's my understanding. The research by Rachel Armitage at the University of Huddersfield, it was a specific impact of secure by design versus a non-secure by design. And I'm sure, like all academic pieces, there would be some differing views on that research, but those are the numbers that we look at. And actually, while it's not academic, but actually we work closely with the local neighbourhood teams, and they see the benefits, particularly actually around where we go into an existing built environment, as I touched on earlier, where there are crime and antisocial behaviour problems, and our local authority partners, regeneration teams, come to us. So they believe that they know it works. They come to us with their capital expenditure budgets, needing our help to make these homes and businesses in these areas safer for Londoners, and actually that it works. And because we see that it works on the ground, we see the benefits. The people who live there tell us of the benefits. But and they are big. They are big numbers. You're absolutely right. But we do see a secure by design versus a non-secure by design, just by the nature of the design and the layout. We're talking tested and certified products. We're talking about communal doors that last. They're cyclically tested, so they last for a long time. They can sustain attack with tools, but actually they're still aesthetically pleasing. Secure by design isn't about, which is often a misconception, isn't about high fences. It isn't about blocking off public spaces. It isn't about creating gated communities. It isn't about that. We're much cleverer than that. It's about creating spaces where there's good natural surveillance, there's good formal surveillance. Actually, people can feel that they're able to occupy and look after their own spaces that they live and work in. And in terms of academic research, where we could do with more, there's always gaps. I think antisocial behaviour is certainly one where the Metropolitan Police, we know it reduces antisocial behaviour, certainly inside residential developments. We know it does. We haven't got any academic research to back that up. We've got some local sort of case study work where we know it works, but that's certainly somewhere where we're missing some good academic research.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We will definitely return to some of those subjects later on in the meeting. But I am wildly running over time, so I've got a few more questions, but I'm going to have to ask for fairly snappy answers from the guests, so I can get on to some of the other subjects. So just again to Guy and or David and Martin, in terms of additional metrics, evaluating the police's role in the planning process, is there anything that the GLA can do in this regard, do you think? Go for it, Elanor.
One of the roles I think is really critical, thinking about metrics and measures, is actually we need to take a much longer term view about this. And one of the estates that I've looked at very closely since it was built in the 1970s is the Mozart estate in Westminster. Mm-hmm. And actually we've often described it as a laboratory for all sorts of designing out crime interventions, everything from Alice Common and Defensible space to community sort of like architecture really taking over to secure by design. It's really interesting, and at various times through the regeneration and changes and nurturing and all the things which have gone on this estate, there have been different measures applied, different sort of like claims about how much crime has reduced. And I think there's some real legitimate things. I think the issue here is about attribution and causality, and you pick up this sort of point. So some pretty dramatic things were happened on moats. They took down walkways. They sort of like blocked up sort of routes through. Some real big changes sort of happened there. But they didn't necessarily have the long-term changes. There may have been a big reduction in a particular type of crime, but something else sort of like went into its base. And I think one of the things that the GLA could really do is, as well as sort of like picking up particular metrics at the beginning of time, it should be looking over time those sort of like consequences, and that's what planning should be about. The bit I would pick up sort of with Martin is there is some very good academic research, and I'm going to mention some stuff we've done with Rachel Armitage as well, but people who live there are the best indicators of what is going on. I think we have to put a lot more sort of like belief in robust, qualitative, sort of like narrative storytellings about how places are actually working. And we need as designers to go back and do better post-occupancy evaluation. We need to really understand how places, not just with there's a design performance gap, which is about design and crime and feeling safe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there anyone else like to comment on anything more the GLA could do in terms of monitoring and metrics? Go ahead.
We would certainly be very happy to work with the GLA around commissioned research around that. We would be very open to that. We're happy to share, where we've got to with that. We can provide you with a list of the studies that are relevant in this area, which may well give you a starting point for further research that you might wish to commission around it. And I say we would love to work with you on that. As a not-for-profit organisation, we're limited to the amount of research that we can commission around that, and we have to sort of balance that between the other initiatives that we're doing as well. So any support from this committee in relation to that, and the Assembly in more general terms, we would be absolutely up for.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I suspect we'll put that question later on. So again, I'm really up against time, so I'm just going to really try and get through a couple of questions. So if you're able to keep the answers as short, that would be great. What challenges, so this is again to Guy and David and Martin, what challenges or limitations do the police face in influencing crime prevention through environmental design?
I think it's probably better to let David have this go.
That's absolutely fine, yes. David?
I think, in terms of limitations, it's a minor point really, but obviously we operate quite rightly within the planning systems. Everything we ask for is proportionate and is reasonable. There's 32 London boroughs, so they operate sometimes in 32 different ways. We've got examples of some really good practice examples. For example, the London Borough of Haringey, where they work with us very, very closely at a very early stage. And actually some of the panel members that just talked about that long-term view is actually that Haringey do take that long-term view in planning ahead. In one big regeneration, one big estate they've got a lot of building work going on, but they work very, very closely with us. So sometimes the challenges are around, depending on how the local authority works closely with us, whether they buy into the idea of secure by design, so that can potentially present a challenge. But in most 32 London boroughs, we get a very good receptive response because they see the value in what we do. But Martin may have something to add to what I said.
Thanks, David. Martin?
Yeah, just one of the limitations we do face within London is actually the existing built environment. So many of the developments we comment upon and work with are actually new build blocks of flats which have to be fitted into an existing street pattern. There's no way we can influence the wider environment or footprint. We simply have to work with what we've got. So mention was made earlier about design and layout such as cul-de-sacs and accessible routes. Quite often we don't have that option, especially in many of the inner London boroughs. We simply have to work with a block of flats that goes into an existing street line. And the best we can do there is to target harden that block because of the existing environments and what is there already, we can't actually influence that footprint according to the development application. The vast majority of applications we deal with are for these existing sites where it's a new block of flats going in. It's relatively rare that we get the chance to influence a whole new estate. It comes up now and again, especially on the outer boroughs, but not necessarily in inner London.
Thank you. Thanks, that's much appreciated. And finally, just want to ask a couple of questions, Guy. So about police CPI, who holds accountability and oversight of police CPI? Is there a role that MOPAC plays? And do you think there's enough public awareness around the role that the police play in the built environment?
You're asking a question I actually feel on solid ground with. Yes, to just describe the structure of the organisation, it's a not-for-profit organisation. It's been it was originally formed over 20 years ago under the Association of Chief Police Officers. With the demise of that organisation, the new successor body, the National Police Chiefs Council, was not able to own it as an organisation. And MOPAC, I think, very gallantly stepped in on behalf of policing for the UK and took ownership of the organisation at that point. It is run as a not-for-profit organisation. It has a board of directors of which MOPAC is the member. They, if you like, it's licensed by guarantee for £1, and MOPAC hold the pound. Yeah. But it has a board of directors who are chief officers from across the UK, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, who represent policing on that board. A couple of non-executive directors helping with finance and business aspects, and myself. So that's the board, that's the governance. But the organisation also reports into a National Police Chiefs Council committee, the committee that is called the Prevention Coordination Committee. So it does what it says on the tin, but it works across different agencies as well. So we report in our activities through that. We run 7 different initiatives, all towards the mission of the overall organisation, which is to be a major catalyst for crime prevention. Everything we do is bent towards that. We generate all of our own income from this, different our activities. We don't draw any money from central government by way of a grant to maintain ourselves, although we do get commissioned occasionally to do things for them. So, for instance, the Safer Streets initiative, we've been asked to help with the design of that initiative, but also provided the training, the guidance, the webinars, etc., to support that initiative. So across the board, we run a series of different crime prevention initiatives, all with towards that mission to be that leading catalyst for crime prevention.
Thanks very much, Guy. Assembly Member Fortune, I'm going to hand over to you. Are you with us?
I am. Thank you very much. It's been interesting to listen to the conversation so far, because some of the things I was going to ask about have already been covered. What I would be interested in is if you look at the latest SBD guidance, which was issued last year, would you, in terms of relations between the police, architects, local authorities, would you say that that guidance has helped or hindered relationships? If we go to police representatives, Martin, David, or Guy.
I certainly think that the homes guide is very important. It's important to my team, because it's as some of the things that were referenced by one of the panel members in terms of is it just the MPS just deciding to influence the built environment in whatever way they see fit, but actually this is national guidance that's been written in consultation with many different partners, the National Fire Service. So what my team has, and the docos across London, and that's where that consistency comes in, because that is the guidance, that is a set of minimum standards that holds certified, tested and products and influences on design and layout that we know, going back to the academic research, that makes changes to that internal and external built environment that we know that reduces crime. So I think actually having that document and having that structure, and it's not a particularly rigid structure either. It doesn't really read like a design. Sometimes it reads like a set of standards, actually, that book, as opposed to a kind of a design guide, which some people don't, some architects don't like. But actually, once they meet with my team and they understand that where we are and actually isn't, that's the line in the sand. You step up, you do that, you've got SPD, you're the wrong side of it, you haven't. It's not like that. Actually, we can achieve good design, the good design aspirations by using that guide. And I think it helps more than it hinders.
Yeah, the word guidance is often taken to mean sort of a set of standards that have to be met. You said there that some architects don't like it, and we've heard some of that feeling expressed this morning. What kind of other things do you hear from architects or local authorities as well? In terms of challenge, I mean, specifically.
David, would you like me to answer?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I think, Mr. Fortune, one of the big issues at the moment is that we're in an inflationary environment. Yeah. And this is having an impact on developers, architects, project managers for ongoing developments. One of the things that we've seen over the past year is that many project leads are having to question costs in a major way, and that is across a number of areas. And security measures in your buildings are definitely being questioned. We say that regularly. There is always going to be a question about from developers about whether they really need to do some of the measures that we're asking for. We have to make our point and argue that these measures are appropriate. One of the big advantages of secured by design is the spend to save measure. If you're willing to spend more on security at the design stage, you will not be having to pick up costs of crime and repair costs in the lifespan of the development. And that's an argument that we're keen to use with developers at the moment. We are seeing a lot of sites where costs are spiraling, the developers tell us, and they're obviously keen to try and argue with us to try and keep those costs down by questioning some of our recommendations. The guidance is there for a reason. Just one thing worth mentioning is that the guide has evolved over time. To deal with new MOs and new criminal techniques, we have to find new ways to try and prevent those. And so the guidance now in 2023 is considerably different from an old guide 13 or 14 years earlier, what was being sought. We have to try and prevent antisocial behaviour within building footprints, whereas 14 years ago, under my predecessors, that was not even considered an issue. Only burglary was considered an issue to prevent. I hope that answers the question to some degree.
It does, and I appreciate you talking as well. I don't want to ruin your plans for karaoke this weekend or anything. But what was interesting there, and I get it, right, because of the inflationary pressures, and I'll know. I remember back from my days at Clarion, when you're waiting for planning applications and it's delayed by months, it really does spiral the costs. But does that suggest then that some of the SPD guidance or principles that are applied to the planning application are considered a bolt-on, as it were? Do you find that they're one of the first things to go if people are up against time or cost pressures? And I don't know, Guy might answer that one.
I was just going to say, I think actually, if anything, it's probably the opposite. I think because of those considerations, planners, certainly in the 9 planning authorities that I work with in my quadrant of London, that all of those will signpost those architects and developers at that pre-planning very early to us, because actually we find that those, as you go through the REBA stage processes, then those costs get worse, because those changes then start to cost more as you go further. But actually, when they're factored in very early in the design stage, you get very little resistance and very few problems. Sometimes it's actually when something just arrives at planning or actually post-planning that we first meet with the designers, then that's definitely where we get some challenges. The later that that someone comes to the table, or we can get in a meeting with people.
Okay, so that's interesting. Can you point us then at some specific London wings? You talked about an example in Glasgow earlier. Are there any sort of London examples that we could go and have a look at after this meeting? Maybe not physically, but go and research after the meeting.
Absolutely, we could definitely, and I think the idea of actually going, if we had the time, we certainly could do it. We could show you examples of poor design, or where actually there hasn't been a strong planning condition when it was originally worked, and it's ended up not achieving certification, and you can see what the end result was. And we could show you actually where an example of secured by design, or actually even examples where at the start there was a design aspiration and secured by design seemed to be in direct conflict, and actually at the end we've got emails and letters and an amazing building that's actually accomplished both. So we could definitely give you some qualitative examples and take you out to site. Absolutely. Okay. Or if that was not possible, to give you a written submission, definitely.
No, I mean, I'd be really interested to receive some examples to perhaps even to go and have a look at. I remember some of the sprawling estates from when I was growing up around Tulsa and places like that were just, it were lots of dark corners with lots of bad things going on.
Peter, I'd be very happy to take you to see some examples of places that are extremely successful, have really strong communities, where neighbours know each other and they love living there, that would not comply at all with secured by design. So I just want to sort of make this point again, if we don't have time to later, that there are serious harms that come with implementing secured by design principles, as well as these other factors that are being argued for. And there are many, you got to remember that secured by design was only invented in 1989. Most of the most successful parts of London were not designed by the police, did not have police involvement in them. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that there are hugely successful communities that are managing to thrive despite not following the principles in this guidance. So please, can we keep that in mind as well? And I'll take you to see some of them if you want.
Sorry, can I just interrupt as the chair? I do appreciate it. Yeah, you wanted to make your point. I promise you, we will come on to this. I promise you won't come into this. And I know it's difficult when there's online discussions going on, but please, if we can just speak when everyone's expecting to be spoken to. Can I hand it back to you, to Assembly Member Fortune? Apologies.
That was the point I was going to make. Was I know we're coming to this, but always it'd be good to see examples where you're getting that community safety at the bottom. The bottom line is that's what we're looking for, isn't it? In terms of the GLA relations, sometimes the GLA, the mayor will call in planning applications. I wonder if there is ever at that point discussions about SPD principles, or is anything sort of added to planning applications after a mayoral calling or after the fact? I'm not sure I explained that properly. Once an application has been called in by the mayor and it's going through a GLA planning hearing, is there any engagement with the GLA on amendments or anything like that? These would be for the bigger schemes.
So we certainly would have had involved, because on all those bigger schemes we would have had some consultation. But I certainly have never been doing the job 6-7 years. I've had very little, if no, involvement in any that type of scenario. But
yeah, I'm not sure how often that would come up. But okay, that's brilliant. I'll leave that there. A lot of it's been covered in the open conversation. Thanks, Chair.
Can I follow up on that specific point, because I think it is absolutely key for the GLA in terms of the planning and regeneration work, is we have to have a clearer understanding of actually where feeling safe, crime prevention actually fits within the whole sort of like suite of guidance documents, everything from the MPPF, sort of like where I think there's been a bit of a dilution down, the balance of beautiful sort of safe places that we sort of like have, which is about this emphasis on community cohesion, which I think is completely and utterly right, to even looking at things like the Mayor's Good Practice Guide for Estate Regeneration, Better Homes for Londoners, which is a brilliant document, but actually it's more concerned about fire safety because of, the time and following sort of like Grenfell when it was there. And I think that's a really interesting example of how that focus towards particular areas, particular concerns. So you have to think about the way that all the guidance around crowded places, sort of like, you know, Westfield, the Olympics, there's the attention within the planning guidance swings to where the concerns are. And I think that's something that the GLA could sort of think about really carefully. I think the point that's been brought up earlier about you know, building Reg Q and the fact that it's having to do all this heavy lifting, and I think that's the balance feels sort of like wrong there. Similarly with the National Design Guides, housing associations, you know, Clarion, L&Q, we all have our own specifications, our design pattern books, which are really, you know, they hold that bit down. The area that I think we do need sort of like to think more clearly about the planning guidance is this how places are made, how places sort of like come together, that long-term engagement in terms of that. And I do think that's something where the guidance that we do have, both in Building for a Healthy Life and the National Model Design Codes, are much, much better. And I really think, and actually I think the homes guidance, the GLA's homes guidance sort of like leans really heavily on the National Model Design Code. And I really think it's very positive the way that it sort of like, you know, it rapidly dives into crime prevention, but under a theme of social interaction. And it really tries to get that balance right between feeling secure, public space, homes as part of, you know, the fabric, which is sort of like there. You know, it is a lot more talking about natural surveillance. And I think, you know, you can look, and I've done a very close look at some of the, say, the SBD and the local plans from Tower Hamlets. And I'd really recommend sort of like taking a look at that, because the work that they did around high density homes, again, really based on really, really excellent in sort of like ethnographical research with sort of like residents. They've come up, the Tower Hamlets local plan is really, really clear that this is about, you know, of their 4 key principles, it's about making people feel safer. It's improving an existing situation that feels really sort of like difficult. And how are they going to go about it? And then they have their SPD, which is all about high density homes. And it has maybe, you know, 95 design guidelines, each of which might have 3 pieces. You know, there's 300 of these bits of design guidance, a lot which are really brilliant, because they're all about how do you reduce, you know, potential for ASB, how do you increase sort of like visual stuff, and surveillance, and really, really positive material. My concern is, here are over 300 bits of design guidance. What if we get some of it wrong? Where we don't have the understanding is how to really concentrate on what is needed in that particular locality. So I think there's brilliant guidance out there. What is needed is more work in terms of both designers and police officers actually interpreting what is going to be needed for a particular scheme. So that's why I think, sort of like Mr. Fortune's question about what happens when difficult schemes get pulled in, how do we really know that we're making the right decisions there? It's absolutely key.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Okay, so the next question is mine, and it's for Phineas and Russell and Elanor. So we've touched upon the fact that there are critiques of secured by design, and you know we're going to ask about a number of areas of those. But particularly, I'd like to start on that. Many critics might say that it just doesn't address the underlying community issues like poverty, lack of opportunities, doesn't take into account community cohesion. Is that something you recognise? Is that something you'd like to talk to us about? Russell?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the job of an architect and any designer, urban designer, is to weigh up many different potentially competing bits of guidance, building regulations, technical guidance, all that sort of stuff, and then arrive at a solution which best addresses all of those. Secure by design is one of those, but there are many other issues. I mean, my experience in working with this stuff, I mean, I've got it in front of me, I won't read it to you, but in front of me I have a list of a critique of a scheme that we designed, a social housing scheme in North London, and you know, quite a lot of the stuff in here is pretty grim, actually, in what we're being asked to do. So basically put gates on everything, you know, take out benches and put in individual seats. All that stuff is, you know, we're designing for a very small minority, okay, so the increasingly unlikely event of crime, and actually forgetting all of the positive things that open space and seating and all those things can do for community cohesion and well-being. Now, a lot of the guidance, I think, a lot of the secure by design guidance is excellent. I mean, it's stuff that you would obviously do. You shouldn't have open space which is not overlooked by habitable room windows. Passive surveillance is important. You shouldn't have back alleys. You shouldn't have gardens, or rear gardens facing onto uncontrolled space. All of that stuff is very sensible. But I think all of that is sort of good practice urban design work. It's not something that we should be designing from the point of fear of crime, and so I would advocate that we think more about what can we do, solving problems of criminality and antisocial behaviour through good quality design, rather than approaching it from a point of, well, how do we prevent young people hanging out on a bench and dealing drugs, or comments I've got here around planting, being able to throw guns and drugs into. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. We're thinking about it in completely the wrong way. So I would advocate for secure by design as an accreditation system, and the sort of the design parts of it, the part one of the design guides, becoming more like planning policy, actually separating it out and becoming an SPD or a planning policy, rather than being a standalone piece of guidance.
And you think that if that happened, that would sort of so it sounds to me what you're saying is it's looking at things in such a narrow way, simply on one interpretation of the creation of crime, that it loses the wider context.
Yeah, and I also worry about the impact that we're focusing very much on a smaller demographic. So I do worry about the impact of secure by design on young people, for example. And how young people experience and occupy the city, and a lot of this seems to be sort of dissuading them from, and they have as many rights as everybody else to live in a city and to enjoy it and make the best of it, but they behave in different ways to you or I. And I think a lot of the guidance in here, or the sort of recommendations in this guidance, don't think about that. And it's all about protecting space, or protecting people from having to see young people occupying public space, which I find problematic.
Thanks. I think I'll return to that in a second, but thank you very much for that. Phineas, did you?
Yeah, Russell used the word nonsense, and there is a lot of nonsense, unfortunately, going on through this process. I have three critiques, one of which I've already sort of talked about a little bit, which is like, in the light of the Casey review, is it appropriate that the Metropolitan Police have so much power over the design of public spaces? We mentioned briefly the question of public awareness. I think there's no public awareness. I think the vast majority of Londoners have no idea that the Met is regularly involved in the design of their homes, their schools, their playgrounds and their streets. Maybe there should be more public awareness, but I don't think anyone's even surveying that. I've just got a little list of some of the interventions that I've seen recently that have come from secured by design. So in Southwark, climbing flowers were cut down on a pergola in a park because the police said that local gangs were hiding drugs in the flowers. This is quite patently absurd, but also the consequence of that is now that what was a really quite nice park is really quite grim now. It doesn't look loved, it doesn't look cared for, and it is precisely that lack of feeling cared for that is going to make it a scarier or a less safe place to hang out. Because previously, if you were in that park, you're like, oh, this is a lovely park. This feels like a great place to be. I feel safe and comfortable and welcome here. Now it looks tough. Now it looks secure. Now it looks like someone you don't want to be, and fewer people are using it as a result. I've also heard examples of cycle lanes being removed after police objections. There was a case in Somerset where a really heavy door was added to an old people's home, but then the old people can't remember the code, that the door is too heavy to push, and they become locked outside of their home, obviously less safe as a consequence of these security measures. There are lots of negative consequences that arise from the sort of the secured by design process as it is currently implemented. Partly that is to do with some of the guidance being fundamentally flawed. Some, not everything in the guidance is completely bad, but there are some serious problems with it. But then another dimension to it is how it is implemented, and it is not always. It is patchy. It is inconsistent. Sometimes it's based more on a kind of a prejudice or a distrust of the community rather than being considered holistically. So I think there are many critiques that one could make of secured by design, but hopefully that gives you a sense of some of them.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Elanor, did you want to come in at this stage?
I was going to say I completely agree about the patchiness of the implementation, but I think there are equally points of really good practice. And certainly when I was doing my PhD, I spent a lot of time hanging out with secured by design officers, and some of them were the ones who really knew the places, then described the way they saw their job as actually sort of like nurturing and understanding. They were the ones who were sort of like hopefully not suggesting the really sort of like radical, ridiculous sort of like changes that you've had examples. So I think we have to sort of say it's a lot about how this type of guidance is used, and if you think how few there are, how sort of stretched, how hard it is to have the examples of really good collaborative working to give people the time to be able to do this sort of like properly, to be able to really concentrate on that sense of, I don't know, municipal housekeeping, that really looking after the place. So I think, yeah, those all sounded terrible examples. I'm sure we could find equal ones. I think there will be equally cases where there will be the other side, where there have been really sort of like positive examples with that. I think there has been a lot of critique of secured by design all the way that it's been sort of like evolving. And there was a piece done by sort of like BRE sort of like back in 1992, and they were actually saying, look, it's too fixed already. It needs to return to the greater flexibility shown by the designers in the creation of its scheme. So I think that's something which has been recognised. Places change and evolve. We need to be able to sort of say, design might influence security or feeling of safety or social interactions, but ultimately designing out crime or designing welcoming, inclusive neighbourhoods, that's the first step. It can't just be the job of sort of like planning or sort of like that. We have to do the best, but then it has to sort of like hand over in terms of how it's looked after and maintained, which again I think is a really interesting role of local authorities, of housing associations, of organisations who should have that longer term responsibility. And I think that's possibly where the relationship with the police is even more patchy. And I think that's where trying to sort of say we have to recognise within the sort of like the life cycle of places, different bits of different relationships come together, and certainly in terms of housing association experience, it's when something goes wrong, or when there is a sort of like a huge problem, that the good relationships that you might have had sort of like initially get really sort of strained.
Can I ask you if you have any sense of why it's so patchy? That might be slightly outside your remit, but...
It probably is. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting is, in the time I've been looking at this, is I've seen the age of designing out crime officers sort of like reducing, which I think is a really positive thing. It's that balance. So there are some really interesting people. I think it's a lot of the things that we've been sort of said before. The pressures of time, of development, of local authorities being able to really give the time and encourage it, and designers as well. So I think it's a squeeze of resources. I think it is also the speed of change of different types of crime. Again, when some of our estates were designed sort of like in the 70s, there was this idea that kids' rough play was vandalism, too high child levels density. We've just submitted material to the APPG in Children in the Built Environment, and I can share that with the GLA, and we're showing how we really have to encourage children outside to play, and all the work we've been doing. And we've got some research we've done on that which shows that the difference between estates that were completed in the 80s and estates which are completed now, where we've actually been really proactive about it, have increased parents' feeling of safety about allowing their kids out to play. And that's a very, very different sort of situation. So I'll finish now.
Thank you. That's helpful. I'd like to ask, and this, Russell, you mentioned sort of how young people potentially effectively sort of, this is not what you said, but is stigmatised by secured by design because the things that they might normally do, I hang around a bit in groups, are sort of considered things to design out. Is there any, do you feel that there are other groups or in fact areas of London where the SPD might have contributed or doesn't adequately make sure that they're not sort of marginalising or stigmatising certain groups? Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm not sure how to respond to that. I mean, I think there is almost an assumption, and I recognise that this is one of the problems is it's hugely open to interpretation. So there are, in our experience of dealing with design out crime officers, we have hugely variable experience. Also, we have variable experience in how the guidance is interpreted or implemented by the planning authority, because it's effectively guidance to the planning authority. But I am going to just read a line from this from this response that we received to a particular scheme. So for the context, this is a small social housing scheme that is an extension to an existing housing estate, or a council-owned housing estate. And it reads, the central communal garden area has the potential to attract misuse from street drinkers and those seeking a quiet space away from the main road to use or deal drugs. And then it goes on to talk about how that should be gated off from the remainder of the estate. Now, this has a very, very adopts a very, very cynical view of people, which I find deeply problematic. The assumption that that space will be used for drug taking and drinking, and by implication, I assume young people hanging out, and it makes a further recommendation about putting individual seats in rather than benches. Now, that may well be true, and it may well happen occasionally, but the vast majority of residents will be using that positively throughout the year, and gaining much enjoyment from it, and meeting their neighbours, and we're trying to promote community cohesion and the sense of neighbourliness and belonging and all those things. And by gating it off from everybody, we're doing the opposite. I'm not. That doesn't really answer your question. I sense that one thing that the guidance doesn't really do is take into account it assumes that everywhere is crime ridden, right? And you're going to, and so it's sort of a blanket approach to different areas of demographic challenges and all of those sort of things. It seems it takes a very baseline level, which I think is difficult. But also, it doesn't take into account particular cultural and ethnic dimensions, which again I'm not in a position to speak about, but I can see how that might be interpreted in a certain way, or it might be people might see that negatively, and I wonder how much input from these different demographic groups has gone into the guidance.
Thank you. You're doing a great job of just segueing into every question just before I do it, but then I have to go and ask the other people and then come to... So Phineas and Elanor, do you have any other contributions around like the either the SBD contributing on mitigating potential marginalisation or stigmatisation?
Yeah, I think the question of who is suffering, which groups are suffering from this is really, really key. We've seen in Southwark sort of concerns about antisocial behaviour, when actually what we're describing is a group of brown people hanging out in a park. That is a really crystal clear example of where racism, filtered through this process by which the police get to change the built environment, can seriously affect a minority group or a marginalised group. I also think that older people and parents particularly suffer. So for older people and parents, having a strong local community is an absolute lifeline. You know, if you're not particularly mobile, then being able to go around and visit your neighbours, get together for a chat, or if you're a stay-at-home parent or just looking after the kids at home, having like local mums in your area, those sort of things, so important. Community is everything for those groups, and it is almost impossible, I think, to create for a community to sort of mature and flourish and thrive within the framework of secured by design, because so much of the kind of, especially the housing section, so much of the sort of emphasis is not on creating infrastructure and public spaces where communities can get together, where you can meet your neighbours and make friends. It's exactly the opposite. It's on making sure that people don't actually meet, that everybody's sort of stuck at home, locked behind their super secure door. It creates a kind of architectural recipe book for a failed community where neighbours don't know each other. In terms of your metric point earlier, I'd love to see a metric on how many Londoners know their neighbours. You know, how many people, because I live on a 1964 estate, would never have been designed today because of secured by design. And I love it. Everyone knows each other. It has such a strong and thriving sense of place, but also sense of kind of neighbourliness and conviviality. But there's so many aspects of it that the police would say are really bad and would make us unsafe. For example, they would object to the fact that it has multiple pedestrian routes going through it. They would say that's excessive permeability. Well, actually, the fact that we have 11 public ways into our estate not only means everyone can walk around, but it means the whole place feels welcoming. It feels open, and that makes it feel less scary, less intimidating, more like a place where you want to hang out. They would also say that the many public spaces on our estate will fail as they, quote, immediately abut residential buildings. But in fact, those public spaces provide essential locations for play and socialising, for community events like Easter barbecues or whatever. It is precisely having that immediate and really rich access to public space within our housing estate that means so many people know each other. So, yeah, I think to come back to your question, I think older people are massively harmed by secured by design. Parents of little children are harmed by it, and we've already discussed younger people and ethnic minorities also getting and no wonder, because this thing is being implemented by an organisation that is predominantly run by white men.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Elanor, you were bouncing around to come in
really
there, but please.
We've got 10 years of data which asks about sense of belonging to neighbourhoods,
yes,
sort of like in our ones. In fact, HACT have a social value equivalent sort of value in terms of that, and it's an absolutely key indicator for us. We also ask sort of like regularly about sort of like sense of safety, sense of belonging, how many neighbours you actually sort of like talk to. It's really, really important to us. I think certainly within the social housing sector and the local authorities, the regulator has, with all the sort of tenant satisfaction measures, one of the big concerns they have is the way that ASB is sort of like being dealt with and sort of like treated. So I think we are at a bit of an inflection point in terms of metrics and measures and data, and I think it's really positive that the measures that we're collecting are very resident-centric, yes, and it's recognising that thing that you know, you need to have that contextual knowledge. An awful lot of really very particular social negotiation goes in a particular locality, and how you actually interpret those metrics to see if they've been successful or not is really, really key. When I was at Peabody, we had a POE question which I absolutely adored, which was so telling of how successful a place was. And it was, at what point do you feel you're at home? And it was like, was it when you got off the bus? Was it when you walked underneath, you know, the Peabody Arch and got onto your estate? Was it when you got up to your access deck? Was it when you actually shut your front door? And that, as a really simple measure, was a really good way of telling whether all this sort of like public, sort of like semi-public sort of space was functioning or not, whether people felt safe. The GLA is doing some really good work around post-occupancy evaluation for housing, and I think understanding that sort of particularity and the fact that we are going to be expected to cut that by ethnicity, by age, by a whole series of to make sure that there aren't sort of like unfair sort of like quality impacts is absolutely key. But we have the measures. We just have to sort of, look at it and use it to inform sort of like what we're trying to do.
Thanks very much. And now my last question, and then you won't have to hear from me again, pretty much, is around consultation, which sort of been mentioned already. And do you think that communities and other potential users of space on a development are being properly consulted, particularly thinking about, as we've discussed, access to the public elements of it? And do you have any views about how community engagement with the police could be improved or strengthened?
I'll be really, really quick with this. I think again the patchiness around sort of like public consultation about changes is widely sort of like debated. When I was thinking about this issue of sort of crime, I was really sort of like conscious that there are examples of good interaction between the police and sort of like particular changes in development or long-term maintenance, but they tend to fall on the shoulders of a few individuals within communities. And I think if we are going to take feeling safe in our communities long-term really seriously, there needs to be as much support than to sort of like really get people engaged with it, to feel that they have the right to sort of like take this collective responsibility for the security and safety of our communities, and that needs to be supported. That needs to be supported in the same way as public consultation around particular schemes is supported, and I think that should be a role of planning.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Russell, Phineas, do you have anything to add to
that? Young people want to feel safe too. They just do that in a different way, and I don't know that we do enough to hear their voices in any of these sort of consultation processes. We do an awful lot of public consultation as a practice, and we work very hard to make sure that we are hearing from the widest possible voices, and not just those that speak the loudest and are the most vocal and attend all of the events. We try very hard to reach all of those groups that wouldn't normally engage with this kind of stuff. But it's really, really hard. And so I really would, advocate for a much better engagement process with young people, particularly teenagers, to make sure that we're meeting their needs in all of this stuff as well.
Thank you.
This is a problem of consultation and proposals in general, but often the range of options that are presented to a community are extremely narrow. So, I was aware of a sort of small tower which had a kind of forecourt. Residents were frustrated with people walking through that forecourt, and the solution was, we'll put some gates on it. So now they don't know their neighbours, it's harder to get, blah, blah, blah. There was never an option of, well, what if we made the forecourt nicer? What if we put some planting in? What if we repainted it or did those repairs that we've been leaving for decades? So I think often that there's an impulse towards stick a gate on it, stick a fob on it, stick a fence around it, when a more holistic, a more intelligent solution could be make it nicer, provide more social infrastructure, make sure that people feel more invested in that space. That is the sort of the intervention that will make a place feel safer and be safer, rather than this instinct to sort of securitize it, put in CCTV, which often actually seems to lead to a deterioration of people feeling kind of safe and secure in that places. So in terms of how we're doing this consultation, I think that we just need to be bringing more options to the community, because if you're only offering them one solution, yes or no, you're only going to be able to get one kind of answer.
Thanks very, very much for the panel, and I'm now going to hand over to Assembly Member Berry, and when we come back, I will be someone else.
Good morning, all. We're just making sure you're paying attention on the live stream and in person to see if you've noticed a change in chairship. Luckily, those in front of me certainly look like they've noticed, and hope those watching online have as well. Good morning to you. As the meeting is now quorate, can we please delegate authority to me as chair, in consultation with party group leads, members, to agree any output arising from this discussion committee? Thank you, and a thank you to Assemblymember Berry for stepping in this morning when I was dealing with some unforeseen circumstances. So we'll be continuing with the questioning and really interesting conversation, and I'll be passing over to Assemblymember Berry to continue this. Thank you.
Thanks need to go to Assemblymember Baker for taking over the chair, not me.
Did I thank you, Assemblymember Berry?
Yeah, you did.
There we go. Well, Freudian
make sure that
slip,
goes correctly
clearly Freudian slip. Assemblymember Baker, many thanks to you, and Assemblymember Berry, over to you for questioning.
Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I want to go back to some comments that you made, Russell, earlier about cul-de-sacs, because obviously I'm very interested in active travel and healthy streets. So I wondered if you wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the issues you have with the way that secured by design guidance talks about cul-de-sacs. I've noticed it says that they may have undesirable features, such as being linked to one another by footpaths. To me, that doesn't sound right. Can you give us a more expert view on why that might be a problem?
Well, I can speak from an urban design point of view, not the sort of the security point of view. But my understanding is that this is largely to do with the pursuit of criminals who might be operating, and cul-de-sacs dissuade them from seeking escape routes from pursuing officers. I'm happy to be corrected on that point, but that's my understanding, particularly with these what they call leaky cul-de-sacs, and that's cul-de-sac linked by alleyways and cycle routes rather than roadways. But I think, from almost every other metric, cul-de-sacs are a failure. They are illegible to sort of walk around and drive around. They promote car dependency, dissuade people from using bicycles. They are detrimental to people's mental health because you're not seeing passing by. As Finn said earlier, I mean, one of the things that particularly older people very much enjoy is seeing people passing by and seeing activity outside, particularly if you're housebound or limited mobility, which just doesn't happen in cul-de-sacs. So, almost on every single metric, cul-de-sacs are a failure, apart from if you're in the pursuit of a criminal. So I think quite strongly that we should not be advocating that as an urban design layout. I mean, for simple terms, as I said earlier, it promotes lots of car movements, not only in people residents moving about in cars, but also things like deliveries and all that sort of thing. It also is quite difficult to do it at density, because you end up with a disproportionate amount of roadway to housing coverage, and also they're quite difficult to plan when it comes to garden space and that sort of thing. So yes, does that answer your question?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, I kind of agree with you on that. I wanted to ask if you've got any examples, because I grew up on a cul-de-sac that was linked to other cul-de-sacs and the main road by foot and cycleway. It would have been a very, very long way to walk to my playgroup had I not had that path. Yeah. Probably too long for a toddler to walk. We'd have probably been using the car if we had one. So yeah, these are all things I can imagine from where I grew up, but that was in Gloucestershire. That wasn't in London. The other example from where I've been a councillor previously in Camden was an informal link did open up between two long roads, that one of which was a very long cul-de-sac leading to an industrial estate, so that's Regis Road. And then Holmes Road, which is a lovely little shortcut, opened up to the Queen's Crescent area. And the police were incredibly quick to come and close that off, even though the cyclists were delighted. So I just wondered if you had any examples of other things like that where these principles or police advice have led to problems within London. Maybe we could go see those. I don't think there are that many cul-de-sacs in London, but
no, but I think but there are quite a few in suburban London. I think that's, again, it comes down to this issue of perhaps of demographics, but having alleyways at the back of a cul-de-sac is a bit of a hack. It's a suboptimal solution to a problem that we've created in an urban plan. So we should just be designing it out from scratch and not building cul-de-sacs at all. Now there are obviously there are other challenges around street-based urban design arrangement, and some of those we've talked about, and I think perhaps would not perform well under secure by design, but there are other very significant benefits from having people walking by and having activity and movement and overlooking of the street. So I think taking all of these things into account and on balance, I would certainly say that a street-based urban design pattern is far superior than cul-de-sacs.
And have you seen any, I mean, not just cul-de-sacs, but we're talking about sort of broader walking and cycling permeability here, which might be other things. Have you seen any examples of where walking or cycling routes have been closed off? Phineas, you may also have examples of that, of where things have been, gates have been put in, or places have been closed, increasing people's journey times or reducing their ability to get around.
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I can think of examples where that recommendation has been made during a design stage.
Yeah, because you're mainly designing things from scratch, aren't you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've had an opportunity to address it at that point, but not retrospectively, not that I'm aware of. Certainly nothing that we've worked on.
Can I
Elanor, you might have an example.
Well, I'm trying to think of examples where we've fought back against that. I'm a member of the Cambridgeshire Quality Panel, so we get to see sort of like a lot of schemes there. And actually, I think a lot of the way that Russell's sort of been describing, thinking really carefully about that hierarchy of how you want sort of like cars and people to interact from sort of like a really early stage, you can avoid it. You can get this sort of like really healthy tartan of movement in a sort of like quite a controlled way. And I'd certainly think in the time I've been involved at Cambridge, we've seen that improving really dramatically. You don't see cul-de-sacs, although you do see actually some quite controlled ways of limiting car access. And I think that's the thing which is really key. It's always assumed that you have to have a cul-de-sac to sort of like limit car access and sort of like encourage better cycling or walking sort of like facilities. And I think that's sort of like not true. And I think there is a way of showing that ideas which were perhaps fixed. I'm thinking of what's the Norwich Passive House scheme, which actually is a grid of sort of like streets, but then it has these sort of like gunnels, these sort of like joined gated things around, and you can imagine secured by design bristling, but it works fabulously because it's been really carefully, thoughtfully, sensibly designed through. It's enabled to have that sort of shared living space between residents and the gardens in a way that works really, really well. So I suggest going and having a look at that, and we can certainly think of some of the ones which are coming through in terms of Cambridge, which are sort of looking ahead. And this is what I mean, where maybe we're just being fortunate that those are, Norwich and Cambridge are two places where those conversations about, well, how are we going to do this differently, are actually allowed.
Can I just pick up on this? Because I think this is kind of key to the whole question of what we're doing here today, which is what changes should be made to the London plan to make it better. We will come on to that in further future questions from other Assembly members. I don't want to jump on everybody's... Because Elanor used the phrase fought back, like we had to fight back against a police suggestion, presumably to make something less permeable, which is happening all the time. And I endlessly, not just see it getting built, but also hear architects talking about having to sort of hustle and fight for decent cycle connections and decent pedestrian connections. So one small change that could be made to the London plan is just to say, keep in mind that the police's priorities are not necessarily the same as the community's priorities, and there is a trade-off often being made. Just to give a little more power to boroughs and to designers to have that fight back, because it is happening. That is very much the theme of our future, trying to come to a conclusion on that exact issue, I think. So I can see that David Lucy from the police has had your hand up for a little while. I'd love you to come in on that particular question, and then I have a question for you next, actually. So
yeah, no problem. It's just that just on that concept of a cul-de-sac, really, I just wanted to cover that off and cover a very brief points. What me and my team and design our crime officers across London will go recommending is that we won't just start creating cul-de-sacs. That just doesn't happen. Cul-de-sac as an example, and accepted crime prevention through environment design principle, just as a concept and as an idea that actually a cul-de-sac that doesn't have any other exit route, we're not saying it's perfect and that's what we recommend, there are benefits in terms of reducing crime in that type of space. We use it as an example That's not to say that we want to remove all permeability. We want everyone to walk into a dead end. It is simply not true. In terms of people wanting to move around and us being want to restrict and gate things off, actually we've got to separate between an existing built environment where something might be gated off. Actually, that normally comes from the community and the public. That actually, because of the crime, they want that gated off. Doesn't always come from us. But the idea we don't want people to move around and we don't want any permeability, again, is just quite simply not true. What we want is busy, active routes used by cars, used by people, used by cyclists, with their busy routes. What we don't want people being able to do is to go off in an unused route where a individual becomes vulnerable because they're in a route that's not well used. So we want people to, be able to move through a development or an area in a space in a safe way. We do not want to stop people being able to move around. It simply isn't true. And actually, that concept of the cul-de-sac actually comes from academic research. This isn't something the police just decided one day. We woke up and actually we quite like cul-de-sacs. This is coming from academic research. So there's a big misconception there. You could look at the National Model Design Code, paragraph 143, actually outlines access and movement requires routes that do not compromise security. But we're not just making this up. We do this to keep people, to Londoners, to keep people safe. We're not trying to remove community cohesion or stop neighbours talking to each other. That's not what the police have had. A lot of individual, non-specific examples being quoted. Mind is about keeping young people in London safe when we're doing the work that we're doing, whether that be working with planning, with a youth and community security scheme where we've got money from MOPAT to make youth centres across London as safe as they can be, to give people a safe place to be with their friends. There's lots of good work that Design Act crime officers do, using those principles of Sector Design Act and secured by design to keep young people safe. So I just wanted to just put that point across. But thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I wanted to ask you a bit more about other aspects of the guidance that worry me too in relation to sort of the inclusive use of public space, and things like talking about seating as being a bit of an issue. Also, some strange. I think some strange words about trees, warning that if they get too big, they might create a sense of enclosure. Now, I wanted to ask you if you had. If you're aware of the Healthy Streets indicators and the Public London Charter, both of which talk very differently about the provision of seating, and the Healthy Streets indicators, one of those is we need shade and shelter from the elements, which obviously is going to clash with your idea of a sense of enclosure. So, first of all, do you look at those other bits of guidance? Both of those are referenced in other London Plan guidance.
Yes, certainly we do, and I think perhaps maybe Guy may be coming in terms of when the guide itself is actually written. There's lots of considerations made and lots of consultations made. Quickly cover off some of those points. Warwick is the Metropolitan Police, secure designed fundamentally against seating. No, we're not. What we look at is a specific crime risk for the location. As it's been talked about, that holistic approach, what does that whole development feel like? How well is that overlooked? So yeah, there may be places where certain types of seating aren't going to be appropriate and they are going to be abused. But we understand that there needs to be seating for people moving through a space, the different demographics of people that need spaces quite right to sit with their friends, with their family or whatever. But all we're saying is it needs to be done in the right way, and that will be based on what we know as a police service about what the crime risk is to that location, speaking to local officers on the ground and speaking to the community. The community leaders, what do they think about it? Trees, I can put it out there now, because the Metropolitan Police is not against trees, neither is secure by design. Actually, we're about healthy, secure, good-looking, well-designed places. But actually, if we're going to do it, we need to do it right. So if we're going to, you could go to any lighting engineer that will tell you if you're going to light up a space, that needs to be done in conjunction with how you're planting and your trees, etc. There's panel members there that know far more than me about that. So all these things need to be joined up. Yes, if there is a need for CCTV, which again, it's been commented, we're not all about CCTV. CCTV isn't the best crime prevention tool. It often captures the crime after the fact. We're about preventing crime fundamentally, but actually when those things are put in, they need to put in good conjunction. So trees need to be planted in the right way. We don't want to plant a forest where you can't There's no passive surveillance. It blocks the formal surveillance. It blocks the lighting. It can create a feeling of a space that's unsafe. Then residents or members of the community don't want to occupy that space because they don't feel safe in that area. So it needs to be done the right way, but we're definitely not against trees. And yeah, actually healthy streets and healthy living, that's something that I certainly talk about with my team, and we look at those documents. But it does come back to the crime risk. I know there's individual specific examples. I'm not saying that we've got it right every single time. We have come a long way. I've been doing design act crime for 7 years, from when I started to where we are now. We engage with far more partners. We work so much better. The scheme has developed itself. So actually some of these principles, these ideas and these bad stories that people are giving are individual. Is not what happens everywhere. And actually we've not always got it right, but we have learned as an organisation. Secure by Design has developed, and it's a scheme that the Metropolitan Police have invested in, and we're passionate about.
Okay, and just then you said you'd look at the specific risk of crime in an area. Does that include looking at? I mean, do you consider the kinds of people who live in that area? Do you look at the demographics, maybe the tenancies, whether it's social housing or private housing? Does that come into it? Because you can see how that might bring in systemic prejudice, depending on how you did that. It could even be subject to unconscious bias, surely.
No, I understand that. So that's great. So I could definitely answer that. So in terms of a development, we will deal with development if in some aspects of it completely blind, whether the tenure, whether it's social, whether it's private. We want that place to be as secure as it can. When I first started, I used to go to sign off developments. And in the social housing element of that development, you would have a call button that said security, and on the private one it would say concierge. So there was a big separation where there was a difference. The way the Metropolitan Police and Secure by Design deal with it is we deal with every single development needs the same security. In terms of demographics, we've worked with the Jewish community in Hackney, and actually complied with their requirements to make sure that actually they can have the best security they can without compromising the things that they need to have. So absolutely, that's just one example where we have worked with a specific end user of that to make sure that the security wasn't compromised. But yeah, we don't deal with, we certainly look at the demographics where we know who the end user, we obviously don't always know who the end user might be necessarily. But we certainly don't deal with social housing in one way and private in another, or privately rented and social rented. We just want to make these places as safe and secure as we can. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and then finally, just on your decision-making process, I think it was one of our guests, I forget which one, said that these principles shouldn't be looked at in isolation. And so when you're making your recommendations, do you purely look at the security aspects of it, or do you try and balance up these other bits of guidance, like the Public London Charter, which says don't segregate or separate people, the Healthy Streets indicators, which are very specific about measures of a healthy street? Do you balance those up and make a balanced recommendation, or are you very much advocating on one side? Because that obviously then that is then the decision of the planning authorities is then different if they are weighing your recommendations up against other policies, or do yours already incorporate them?
No, definitely. So what I have this conversation with my team very regularly is, for me, that's not about working well with our partners. I don't want to push our recommendations push that through to the planners, and then them sitting there deciding, who do I listen to? Do I listen to the police? No, absolutely not. It's about compromise. It's about, we could count examples, as I kind of touched on earlier, where we start at the first meeting and you've got the design concept and the secure by design, and then at that point seen in direct opposition. And actually, once you've had meetings and once we've had a look at it and we understand what's trying to be achieved, and we look at maybe it's the crime trends, we look at the local demographics, we look at what else it's trying to achieve, and we can say, okay, and we can look at other ways of achieving the same thing as well. It isn't a black and white thing in terms of secure by design. There is we can move between the lines, and we can achieve what we need to achieve, and the design team, the local authority, the end user, the social housing provider, the management of the block, whatever they're trying to achieve, that's something that we always will take into account.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Berry. I'll be passing over to Assemblymember Best now.
Thank you. I think the question I was going to ask has been covered mainly, but I had a couple of supplementaries. Mainly, Guy, for you, felt like you were in the crossfire there, and I thought there's probably some things you wanted to say back. So I'd give you that opportunity to come back on a few of the bits that were mentioned earlier, but I as well had some specific questions I wondered if you could answer, and I think we just touched on it there around the cul-de-sacs, but the way I read the guidance on cul-de-sacs was more not saying we have a preference for these, but these are this, if you're going to have it, this is some of the things to watch out for, basically. And by the way, some of the my ward's got a lot of cul-de-sacs, and where you have the cul-de-sacs, you have the best communities ever. They do everything together. So I think, much like everything, you know, you can't design, and I think we appreciate this, you can't design crime out through, you know, designs. A lot of this is to do with social factors and who's living where, and what type of people might like to get up to, and you can't account for that. So I wanted to know your view on the cul-de-sacs. Was that, because I think there was some confusion over that. And the other question I had in your response is, you know, some things in the SBC guidance are just blatantly obvious, and I don't think anyone would disagree with them. But other things can seem quite contradictory. So, for example, you want to create open spaces and not create kind of closed, covert spaces, yet, you know, for example, saying in Mugger pitches having 1.2 metre fences. And to me, those statements are quite contradictory. But I wanted to give you the chance to come back on the things we've heard earlier and perhaps a couple of those questions that I had.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll have first go and then hand back over to Dave, who's probably in a stronger position dealing with this every day. I think the whole point of the Secure by Design guidance is that that's what it is. And it's a sort of an opportunity for discussion. I think, you know, practically, the work that the designing out crime officers do is to negotiate and discuss and to come up with the best solution for everybody. And these things are, to a large extent, a compromise as well. Something that I thought that was probably a point worth making, though, around designing out crime officers in general as well, is just recently the National Police Chiefs Council have made the role a specialist role, which is that they prescribe a level of training but also a level of continuous professional development. In previous times, you would go through your process and be trained to be a designing out crime officer, but then you wouldn't necessarily have to keep up to date with the sort of changing landscape that is the guidance around these. That has changed in the last 18 months. That's been prescribed. So now all designing out crime officers have to, one, be trained, but two, be regularly going through continuous professional development, and we're looking after that side of things on behalf of policing at the moment as well. So we're doing that work to make sure that, I think there was another point earlier on about the lack of consistency sometimes. I think Assemblymember Berry was saying there was a lack of consistency across that, and that is something that we're trying to address on behalf of Policing UK, but also obviously as more and more people come into contact with them through the environmental visual audits and other work that we've been doing, that there needs to be some standardisation so that people can see that consistency.
Thank you, that's appreciated. And Elanor, I wanted to come to you next, if that's okay, to ask, when you've been looking at how SBCs work with SDB, is when you've been looking at the different places where they've been implemented, is there a certain typology where you think the guidance works versus a certain typology where perhaps it doesn't? And then as a supplementary to that, I would ask, in your opinion, is there, aside from that, a type of typology that you think works best, or creates the safest communities?
I think we have to find ways of making all the different typologies that we have work. And one of the things I really like about the way that the London Plan guidance has evolved is it's thinking very much about optimising what is the right typology, not just for a site for that particular development, but how it sort of like fits and knits into sort of like the wider fabric of where it is. So I really think we can't say, oh, we should always be, you know, this type of typology. We have to make them all work. I wanted to refer back to a piece of research I did when I was at CABE, which we did with the Home Office and Rachel Armitage, who knows everything about sort of like secure by design. And this was looking at creating safe places to live through design. It's what it's called. It's on the Design Council website still. And we wanted to do something slightly different. We wanted to take schemes that had been award-winning, and they'd all had sort of like Building for Life good. They were ones which CABE were talking about as really sort of like positive spaces, and actually then map where crime was happening and to look exactly at your point at what was it about these different typologies and these different typologies at higher density that were changing the type of crime that was happening or where they were happening. And it was absolutely fascinating because we only looked at 6 schemes, but they were carefully chosen to reflect different types of typologies. So we looked at in Manchester, as like a block by the canal, which was, you know, big, solid, sort of like lots of flats going through. We looked at a gated community in Manchester, which was interesting. Sort of like an urban village, some high density, quite carefully designed town extensions, the sort of thing you might see out in sort of Barking Riverside now, that sort of like stuff. But all of them were ones which were really meeting current design practices. Although what we found looking at the crime was, although crime was low, it still existed. And again, it was like, what was the type of crime? Was it criminal damage? You know, there'd be maybe very low levels of burglary, huge amount of stuff which was all about parking and stress around parking and vehicle crime and, you know, ASB, which was related to where I still saw bits of ASB. There were very clearly different types of crime and different types of problems which were related to the typology. So the Manchester big block, it was all about sort of like gaining, if you got into the block, and that sometimes you could get in via sort of like balconies, and once you were inside and there were sort of like routes sort of like through, you could get down to where the bike stores were, and the bikes just, you know, disappeared out. So that was very, very sort of like particular. There was one suburban infill and it was in a hospital, built around sort of like a hospital, sort of all the bits of sort of like stuff there. And it was almost the patchiness about the quality of the places. So again, it had lots of large rear parking courts, which didn't really work, but then it had lots of really nice places where people did come and sort of like gather together. And what you could do by mapping it out was saying that the relatively low number of burglars, you know, they located near the footpaths and the alleyways leading to the parking courts, not the routes and the parts which were leading to the green space, which were well used. So it was really, really picking up all the things we've said about how actively used things are, that, you know, if there were enough bikes going through a sort of like a place, there probably wouldn't have been those. Really, really, some of it's really obvious. There was this really interesting sort of gated community which had this sort of like security points. But again, although there were lots of fences, they weren't well enough designed to sort of like actually avoid the weak points. And what we found, huge amounts of vehicle crime inside and outside. It was really sort of like problematic there. But the most successful transformation with the scheme that we looked at was Castle Vale in Birmingham. And this was a total redevelopment of high-rise towers, and actually a really nice phased scheme. And I think it's the way that it had been rebuilt, both for sort of like houses and, you know, 3-4 story blocks, but it had a very simple legible structure. But I think as important was the way that it had been redeveloped. And I think this is the message that we have to come back to time and time again. If you're going to make changes, if you're going to make sort of like develop new buildings, you have to build them with the existing communities who's there, because they're the ones who understand what the changes in crime need to be. They were the ones who were sort of like making the advice about how they wanted the sort of like the routes to go through. And I forgot what your second question was. It was about typologies, wasn't it? So I think
you answered that. You said that there was no better typology, that we should make them all. But I do think, and while we are talking about typologies, I am very concerned about
density of occupation. And again, Alice Coleman was obsessed with the number of people, the number of doors you walk past in terms of like who you knew. And I think the higher number of people we have living together does increase pressures on territoriality. And I think we have to be really, really careful that a lot of the principles we have around defensible space, around secure by design, you know, they may be sound, but they'll falter if we apply them either in a very exaggerated way, if we ignore them, or if we're trying to apply them in situations where there are just too many people around. And I think that threshold of, you know, actually where does this work? Where does this work maybe in a sort of like an infill in a particular area, but actually it's not going to work when there are more people around. I think that's the bit that we need to be investigating more to understand better.
Thank you. And talking about future investigations or future work, I was going to turn to the London plan now. And by the way, we are quite tight on time, so if the answers could be fairly concise, that'd be brilliant. Going to come to yourself, Guy, and if you need David and Martin online as well, then just shout. But have you been involved in the current London plan review process, or have you ever been involved in any part of the London plan review process?
I know my late colleague Anne Burrows on our behalf did a lot of work on the last London plan. David and Martin may be able to give you some more up to date. They'll be more current than I am.
Okay. David, Martin, did you want to come in quickly on if you've been involved on the London plan review?
Yeah, we certainly were. At the last London plan, actually, we did that in conjunction with, at the time, there was a discussion around fire versus security, and Martin actually presented a hearing in relation to that in conjunction with the Assistant Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, been involved in that. In terms of this stage of the London plan at the moment, we haven't had any involvement, but we would welcome any input or consultation that you wanted from us.
Thank you. Moving on to our panel guests and looking at what you'd like to see perhaps in the London plan, are there areas where you believe the guidance could be strengthened or clarified to get better integration of crime prevention principles? Is that Phineas? You're hovering on the mic.
I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head earlier when you said you can't design crime out. A lot of this is to do with social factors. That's exactly right, and that's what all the kind of built environment professionals I know talk about all the time. Elsewhere, the London plan is very clear on those social factors being a priority, but on this particular question of when boroughs should engage the Metropolitan Police, it defaults to this sort of blanket statement of you've got to get the police involved. They'll have input that you need. So I think that the change that we need to see from the new London plan is a revision of those paragraphs to empower boroughs to think more holistically. You know, the Secure by Design guidance on schools includes the word learning twice and the word surveillance 26 times. And that is a really clear example for me of how it is not holistic. It is not taking into account all the things it needs to take into account. But there are boroughs out there, and there are good designers who want to think holistically, and so the new London plan should be empowering them to do so. So, for example, if you're designing a playground for young women, rather than going to the Metropolitan Police for advice on how to do that, the London plan should be recommending architects and landscape architects who have a strong female-led workforce, for example. It just needs a bit of moderation to say there are other opinions that are available. The police have a particular perspective, but it is not the only way forward, and that responsible designers should be thinking holistically to make sure that all communities and all groups are properly represented in design decisions.
But I would say it is guidance, isn't it? So should there just be a better avenue for which, for example, where I used the mugger pitch earlier, it says put a big fence around your mugger pitch, and when you're doing an application, you can just easily say, we've taken this into consideration, and X is the reason why we aren't doing that, and these are the people or stakeholders we've worked with to come to that. Because the police are going to or those that are concerned with safety are going to take a particular view in it. And in some ways, it's right that they're the champion of that, much like the fire brigade, as a statutory holder, are going to do that, and that the tree officers are going to protect their trees with their lives. But it's all the kind of, with all those other guidance, we would take that in and say why we haven't done that, or a planner would say why they haven't done that. Is that not clear for people to do now?
Well, no. I mean, as David sort of described earlier, often it's the police's advice that is taken to be the most sacrosanct, and it's the other bits that get cut out. We heard that about property developers, that the security features that have been suggested through the Secure by Design process are kept, and other bits are lost. So it's not the case that currently boroughs and developers and architects are able to take that holistic view. And I think that's probably to do with lack of resources. It's due to feeling like they have no choice other than to do what the police have recommended, even though none of this stuff is statutory, even though legally they're under no obligation to follow any of these things as long as they're following the building regulations. So that's the clarification that needs to be emphasised in the new London plan, that this is all optional and that it is only consultancy, and that you could take a different view.
Thanks. And Russell, I'll come to you. And should the London plan be explicit in designing out crime principles?
I think it should be explicit in as much as it's possible that the London plan can take a more holistic view. So I think a lot of these, as I said earlier, I think a lot of the things that are in the Secure by Design guidance are very, very sensible, and any urban designer or architect worth their salt would implement them. I think it's our responsibility to weigh all of those factors up against other things. So I think guidance is very sensible. I think the problem is, and Finn's touched on this, that the attaching of weight to the guidance varies between clients, and it varies between different planning authorities. And so we have, particularly in the case of local authority clients, so the borough clients, where they're commissioning buildings, they have a slightly, it's a bit like designing for fire. You can't possibly be seen to design anything that might be compromised in terms of fire, even if that leads to all sorts of other problems. It's the same with designing out crime, that nobody would want to be seen to be going against any guidance if that was specifically there to prevent crime. But I think it has lots of unintended consequences that are perhaps less easy to quantify, and therefore it sort of falls by the wayside. So for example, things like mental well-being and social integration and all of those sort of things, which are more difficult to measure, but you can point to a piece of guidance that says, well, is it a seat or is it a bench? But it's much less difficult much less easy to look at that and sort of what impact does that particular intervention have on the wider well-being of the community? So I think as I said earlier, I think the latter half of I'm thinking about the Holmes recommendations in the Secure by Design guidance is sensible, and certification is sensible for those people who want to pursue it, but the urban design stuff shouldn't be in there, and that should be in an SPD or in planning guidance.
Thanks. Elanor, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I was going to pick up on exactly the thing that both Russell and Phineas have said about trying to look at this holistically, and the struggle that I think realistically the London plan has to it. And I was involved with trying to devise lifetime neighbourhoods, which had a really brief, I think it was in one cycle of the London plan, and sort of got cemented into it evolved into this idea of sort of like good growth. And I don't think it's the same thing. I think the whole thing underneath lifetime neighbourhoods was to try and have communities' well-being, in terms of if they were here existing, people who are coming in, at the real heart of it. And it's very similar to a piece of work which again didn't really get off the ground, which was this idea that we need to have another building regs. We need to have a building regs W for well-being, which actually brings together some of these really contradictory aspects which are seen as guidance, which are about, fire safety or air protection, which actually don't recognise that the interaction of the environment and homes with individuals is going to vary dramatically depending on who they are and their sort of like particular situation, and that's really easy to forget. So what we might need is something which is either regulatory or guidance, which actually sits there and says, okay, we have these schemes, but what is the impact it's having on people?
Thanks, Chair. I think you've got -2 minutes to get through 3 questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Assemblymember Best. We'll be passing over to Deputy Chairman, Assemblymember Fortune, and you're right, we are attempting to wrap up this final section in about 10 minutes so that we can make space for the next panel.
So,
thank you.
Sorry, didn't mean to speak across you, Chair. I mean, a lot of what I was going to ask was recommendations for the London plan from the panel, and we've touched on a lot of that. So I'll ask this specific point, and specifically about the London plan, in that what do you think it could do to address any social issues that the capital is facing? So crime, poverty, inequality, the London plan itself, what can it do, or how can it be adapted? If we go to, should we start with Phineas?
Well, I'm sorry to sort of sound like a broken record, but I do think just acknowledging the findings of the Casey review is really important for the London plan. Londoners like me are very concerned that an institution that has been found to be systemically racist, misogynistic and homophobic is the same institution that is having a lot of influence over the design of their built environment. They are concerned that potentially those systemic biases might be playing out in some of the specific advice that comes forward from officers and could be leading to negative outcomes for those marginalised groups. So I think the London plan needs to sort of just recognise those findings and advise local authorities to respond appropriately. And then the second thing that I think the London plan needs to suggest is alternatives to security as the main way of keeping people safe. In fact, those two things are not the same, right? Being secure does not always mean that we are safe. Sometimes it can even mean the opposite. And so I think the London plan should be recommending other ways of building strong communities, such as improving the public realm, better community infrastructure, more care, more gardening. Like, those are the things that will make places feel and be loved, and will help people to feel safe in their neighbourhoods.
Just quickly on that, because the police have a core responsibility about preventing and resolving crime, and the fire brigade has been touched on as well. And without, just drawing those parallels, are you concerned about the fire brigade's input into the local plan?
Sometimes, because fire engineering is a specific and highly specialised expertise, and what sometimes we see in the UK and in London is fire brigade officers being turned to as if they are fire engineers. They're not qualified fire engineers. They've not done the thorough training. Obviously, they perform a really important role, but it's a different role.
But in terms of the cultural review is what I meant more, because that's the parallel you're drawing.
What I'm trying to say is that we need qualified experts to make design decisions.
Sure, but I get that. But police are qualified experts around policing. But you were saying that the cultural review would have an impact on that professional view they would give on policing. There was the same impact with the fire brigade in terms of cultural review. Would you make the same application to their input for the London plan?
I think I'm not quite sure I'm asking the question. It's shame you're not in the room, but I'm saying that sometimes we're asking the wrong professionals to comment on something that actually they don't have the best training in, they don't have the best holistic thinking in, and that an improved London plan would emphasise that if you're thinking about fire safety, you need a fire engineer, and that a fire brigade officer is not quite the same thing, and that sometimes they will give very, very different advice. And so if we want to have extremely competent professionals making design decisions, then we need to make sure we're resourcing that properly, rather than getting someone who hasn't got that expertise.
The police officers that are engaged in this programme, that are not sufficiently qualified?
Yes, exactly. I'm saying that police officers who are designing out crime officers are not built environment experts. They're not bringing the holistic thinking that more qualified professionals would to the situation. And sometimes their advice, and we've talked about lots of specific examples today, sometimes their advice flies in the face of what actually the community needs.
Okay. Thank you. Can I move to other members of the panel, because I've probably already gone over my 3 minutes. Sorry, Chair.
You have more than 3 minutes, Assemblymember Fortune, but thank you for your...
All right, well, what I'll scoot on then is I'll go to Guy, David and Martin, which was in terms of security in the built environment, how do we in London compare to similar European cities? What are we doing well? What could we do better?
I think... Sorry, I'll just come in and hand it over to you, David. Just in terms of no other European country apart from Holland has adopted the secured by design approach. The approach where policing is able to comment on issues of prevention is the unique partnership that we've got set up in relation to how that works. Phineas keeps referring to Casey and why policing shouldn't be involved in this process. Well, you know, Casey doesn't actually refer to police crime prevention initiatives.
That's what I was trying to pull out there. Sorry,
I don't think we featured at all in Casey, and certainly our work is very much with the designing out crime officers, who, again, I don't think drew particular fire from the Casey report. So I really think that's an irrelevance in terms of where we should be focused, really, because all the secured by design advice that's been developed over the last 30 years is drawing on academic evidence, is drawing on other people's guidance around that in terms of what can we do to make our communities safer. That's what it's about. And when we talk about the impact on communities of crime, the impact on individuals is something which I've been involved in this for over 40 years. The impact on individuals is catastrophic. It is catastrophic in terms of people wanting to move from premises when they've been burgled. And I perhaps don't need to rehearse this to this audience, but that's why policing is involved in this. Is in what it can prevent in terms of crime. It's not a big brother preventing people having nice gardens and things like that. Secured by Design doesn't want to do that. It wants to try and make communities as safe as it possibly can be.
David, I'm very aware of time, so if you've got 1 minute, because I saw you wanted to come in.
Yeah, not really much. So other than to say what's in the London plan for us, I think has worked. It's important. A couple of things we haven't touched on is we have a counter-terrorism member understanding, so the DOCO lead through the planning system, so we ensure those counter-terrorism measures as well are all incorporated through us through the planning system. Design out crime officers, we are specialist trained officers with national qualifications. It's proven to work. I think us having that reference in the London plan for me is really important. And I think Guy's covered off all the other bits I was going to cover, but thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry about the time pressure. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your quick questioning, Assemblymember Fortune, and for your brevity at the end to the guests. I have to say that was a fascinating conversation, and I think the disagreements are often healthy, because I think we're interested in good governance, and that means teasing out a variety of perspectives. So I know that the committee is always interested in, following up on conversations that we start. There will be a variety of follow-ups that we'll probably get in touch with you afterwards, but I want to thank you a lot for your time. In particular, one particular follow-up I wanted to just make sure we did capture in the transcript was Elanor, I think you were going to give us the submission around children and built environment, your submission to the APPG, as well as some of the data you had on the metrics of some of the questions, Phineas, I think you asked around who knows their neighbours in London, and what does the impact of this conversation have on enabling that. So many thanks for your expertise to the guests in person and those who joined online. And I'm also being passed something to probably read out, so give me a moment.
Is that really being asked?
This question here. I think there's something that perhaps we've been asked to clarify. Guy, I hope you don't mind, but we're just asking about whether there's any funding received from MOPAC or the GLA at your organisation, just to offer clarity for the audience.
The only funding that we've received from MOPAC was in relation to asking us to conduct a fraud prevention initiative. That was the only funding that we receive. We don't receive any maintenance grants or anything like that from MOPAC. MOPAC, as I said earlier, gallantly stepped in when with ACPO's demise to own us as an organisation on behalf of Policing UK, and I think it's been a very helpful opportunity which has allowed us to develop. But in terms of funding from MOPAC, we don't receive any funding from them.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, and I will begin to wrap up so we can take a few minutes break whilst we transition to the next panel, where we'll be welcoming the Deputy Mayor and Lisa Fairmanner. Like I said, I found this conversation fascinating. I think before this particular committee meeting, I certainly wasn't aware of the role or the significance of the presence in the Met Police in terms of how we plan and guidance. So I think it has been enlightening, and like I said, there will certainly be follow-up. And once again, a huge thank you to the guests who came in person and those online for joining us for your expertise. We will now take a 5-minute adjournment whilst we swap panellists. So we will be restarting the live webcast at 22 minutes past 12. Thank you. And welcome back to the London Assembly's Planning. And welcome back to the London Assembly's Planning and Regeneration Committee. We will now continue our discussion on crime and planning, and I would like to welcome our second small but powerful panel. We have Jules Pipe, CBE, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, and Lisa Fairmaner, Head of the London Plan and Growth Strategies at the GLA. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We will kick off with a question that I'll be starting with, which is, what is the GLA, in collaboration with the Metropolitan Police Service and other stakeholders, doing to improve the safety of Londoners by identifying and addressing vulnerabilities in the built environment?
That is a very broad question. I can't answer for the wider work that the myriad GLA, parts of the GLA and TfL and probably the LFB and others undertake with the MPS. But so you're asking specifically in relation to the built environment?
Yeah, perhaps you could make reference specifically to areas in the London Plan that you think encapsulate the GLA's approach to safety for Londoners.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Chair. In the process of developing the 21 plan, the policies were significantly updated from the 16 plan throughout, and it was recast in form from the previous plans, sort of the 11 and 16 one. There had been a dedicated section within the 2011 plan that was pretty much, I think, cut and pasted into the 16 plan. For our plan in 21, all the policies were effectively absorbed throughout other bits of the plan rather than seen as a sort of a standalone checklist of things and in competition with other policies. It was an attempt to kind of weave them throughout the other policies. So much of what was in the old policy 7.3 you can find throughout D3, optimising site capacity through the design-led approach, D5, inclusive design, D6, housing quality and standards, D8, public realm, and also HC6, supporting the nighttime economy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Was there anything you wanted to add to that? Okay.
And obviously, sorry, that is in terms that the answer I just gave then is obviously about sort of planning policy and thinking and forming planning policy. Obviously, there's the other half of the process, which is a bit of a remove from here often, and that's the actual application of the policy and measuring a planning application against that policy, in which case a local borough obviously will then have responsibility for considering those applications in conjunction with the police, often through designing out crime officers.
Thank you. And I might jump around with my questioning a bit because you've already
prompted Lisa to think of something.
Okay.
Yeah, my apologies. Just, I don't think it was mentioned, but policy D11, part B, also specifically deals with safety, security and resilience to emergency, with particular reference to community safety needs, for example.
Thank you. And as I was just saying, it's sort of making me want to jump around a little bit with my questioning, because I think you sort of made reference to a one further down, which is, so as you also mentioned in the previous London Plan in 2016, there was explicit reference to designing out crime strategies and what that could look like. And you sort of already mentioned, Jules, that in the 2021 London Plan, that's sort of been more interspersed in different aspects. Can you just elaborate a little bit about why that change in approach and why you think that's been beneficial?
I think, it's often said, and correctly said, that the plan and inevitably its application is done on balance. You both have to reach a balance between competing, conflicting priorities in both the formulation of the policy, and then even then you go further with effectively compromise when applying those policies to different extents when you're considering an actual application. And where that is illustrated, I think in respect to this particular issue, if I give you some examples, good pleasant public realm, benches, for people to rest on, planting, interesting planting, for example, not having long, monotonous, canyonized building form. Those could be three things that you'd consider would be a good attribute of public realm. But on the other hand, to someone, well, I hesitate to say to a DOCO, a designing out crime officer, but perhaps to those who are looking with quite a black and white approach to designing out crime, to them they might look at that a sketch of that public realm and say, actually, no, we want the straight lines of sight, which are invariably a good positive thing. I don't want to speak against that, but maximise the straight lines of sight. We don't want any planting that people can hide behind. Actually, even low shrubs, well, people can hide drugs and knives in them, and we don't want benches because people will loiter. And there are other examples. One that I encountered actually in a call-in was that the advice, designing out crime advice, was not to have different tenures having the same access to the car park, simply because it would create multiple routes for criminals to use to access different parts of the estate. So thereby segregating different tenures within an estate for a communal use. Again, that would be seen unacceptable in design terms. So there is this tension between having just a checklist, do this, do this, do this, don't do that, whereas actually when forming the policy we thought it would be better to actually try and take an integrated approach in thinking simultaneously about what's good design, but also thinking what contributes to a safer public realm.
Thank you. I think that's really well explained and makes me feel actually quite reassured, because I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head and almost encapsulated the kind of the last conversation, really, which is that tension between sort of design principles, but also sometimes what the Met Police would want to sort of offer in terms of their guidance. And I think it's really interesting, the example that you've used. I mean, I don't know the case that the application you're referring to, but different tenures accessing the car park or not having access to the car park. Could you just actually, if there's no confidentiality issues on this particular application, talk us through how that balance was struck in that instance?
Well, the advice wasn't taken. I mean, it's a unified, because it was a podium design, and so all the blocks do have access. I mean, it would all be swipe access, but nevertheless, it's all the same access to the same car park, rather than having subdivided car parks. So they weren't saying that certain tenures shouldn't have access to a car park. It was purely that it shouldn't be one big car park that they all have access to. But I mean, taking it to its logical conclusion, you could say, play areas shouldn't be shared simply because it adds more ways through estates. So it's I think there's again, I suppose one can summate it as permeability. I think it is often argued in crime reduction terms about to reduce permeability and encourage cul-de-sacs, whereas good public realm tends to encourage permeability, and also through traffic. Again, through traffic is often it's sometimes accepted in pedestrianised areas late at night, and one can see an argument for maintaining an increased level of activity at night time through a pedestrianised area. But sometimes pedestrianisation at any time is contested on the grounds of it would increase crime, whereas that's not something from a public realm perspective that's accepted. And actually, greater pedestrian throughput is seen as more effective in deterring crime. And also, that's looking at it from the negative point of view, more positively, fostering community and activity and a coming together in a social atmosphere. So again, that's looking at the same thing, but from a more positive perspective.
I mean, again, precisely, I think you're drawing out some really key threads from the conversation we heard from the first panel. The one of the sort of key aspirations, I think, of good public realm design is creating ways that people can have communal space, feel like they can create a neighbourhood where there's home. Interesting question posed to the committee earlier, how many of us know our neighbours, and looking at the data around that. And just before I move on to my final question and pass over to, I think, Assemblymember Best, do you think on balance or do you think that balance is being struck enough in applications, looking at the design of good public realm versus advice from Secured by Design?
That's a difficult question. I certainly would say that it's a very live issue, and it's a lively debate. And coming up to the next London plan, I'm sure a lot of these things will be up for debate. Certainly the detail. I'm thinking. An example that actually I was talking to Lisa about just before we came in. Take, for example, the issue, the plan says, recommends that there should only be a maximum of 8 flats off a core on each floor in a block of flats. Now, that hasn't been plucked out of anywhere. That clearly came out of research and thinking that precedes me by many years. But having, as I'm sure all the panel, elected members on the panel will have spent plenty of time in a variety of different blocks of different tenures and types, and experienced all sorts of multiple entrances, cores of all different shapes and sizes, which are the ones that you felt safest in? And I was in one recently that falls outside the guidance because it's build to rent, and it has, I don't know, it probably has several dozen flats off a long corridor. But the corridor was probably about twice as wide as a regular corridor that you would see in many blocks, whether private or municipal. You saw daylight at either end. There were multiple doors to go to if you thought that there was a problem. And I felt infinitely more comfortable in that block, and I would imagine other people would, than ones where you've only got, say, 4 flats off a core. You're going from floor to floor down the stairs, entering each one of those with 4 flats. So, a lot of it is down to perception, and I think it's those kind of issues, exploring that kind of the at a micro level, those things, and to test whether the current thinking is correct. So, I can't say that. I can't really hazard a guess about how often it's being got right at the application stage, when I think even the policies are always up for a healthy debate about whether the right one's being applied.
Thank you, Jules.
But you're absolutely right about keep on using the word balance. All this stuff is a balance, because you're compromising all the time on competing priorities.
Thank you for that. Lisa, did you want to add anything?
No, I just would say that where those tensions do arise, quite rightly at the moment, particularly in the London plan, inclusion would always win out. So bringing communities together and providing a design that brings people together would be the way that you'd find the optimal solution, even if Secured by Design suggests you do or don't do something like gated communities is a good example, where that isn't the preferred solution, and it is never going to be, because it goes against inclusion, and often those tensions are to do with inclusion. The same with things like seating and things like that.
And also, I think a lot of the kind of the things that cause attention could perhaps be resolved by good design earlier in the process. Another example that I was given from the same application was that the police were objecting to the porches, the design of because it was street access to the homes, and they didn't like the porches because people could loiter in them unseen. Well, I don't know, perhaps you could splay the entrances to the porches. Obviously there's a floor plan loss there, which could be an issue, but what other ways could it be explored? In planting, how creative could you be in the types of planting so it could be low, so people couldn't hide behind it, but equally you had, I know this is getting into minutiae, but planting that had stems to it and perhaps solid, some sort of surface treatment so people couldn't stash knives and drugs in it if that was the issue. So it is the minutiae, but this is all about good design and designing out problems rather than treating it as a don't have that element. Design an element that's good and workable, but at the moment, people propose an element and then perhaps sometimes there's a crude response about don't have that element.
No, I found that very fascinating, actually. Thank you. And I think the minutiae is something the committee always welcomes in terms of thinking about, how we design. Just the final point now, and I think Assemblymember Best, your supplementaries have been covered, as I understand, so I will pass over to Assemblymember Berry in a moment. But how does the GLA, and please feel free to say whether you think this is actually better placed to be aimed at a different body, not different body, but more specific within the GLA, how does the GLA monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of crime prevention measures implemented through the London Plan?
I mean, there's the overall crime statistics, and there are things that we would look at. Obviously, they'll come into any integrated impact assessment as the kind of baseline if there's improvement over time. But I think it's the attributability, which is a terrible word to try and say when you're at a committee, but it's there because there's a whole lot of other things going on. There are a lot of social impacts, there's a lot of social change, there's a lot of social cohesion issues, and things can happen over time. There's been profound changes in London over time, and those have been often centred on particular locations, and they have happened for specific reasons, and no amount of designing out crime or other type, you can't separate those from each other. Notwithstanding that, the statistics, for example, around burglary, for example, of course it's going to be better to have, visible entrances to buildings, windows that are properly lockable and can't be jimmied open, all of those things, of course. But I do think it comes back to those perceptions of safety. Where are the spaces that people feel safe, and actually listening to communities, rather than taking a far more empirical approach to these things.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I wonder whether you could even, can you quantify the effects of secured by designs on crime? Jules?
Well, I think, when you have a complete renewal, say within a particular red line boundary and a state renewal, and it's been comprehensive, time and time again you see people will write an article quoting stats about the crime levels then, the crime levels now. But I go back to what Lisa said, how you attribute any of that to individual actions, particularly when so much else will have changed around the surrounding area. Often the change in people on the estate as well. There are so many variables that have changed. It's as I say, God, I can't say it now.
Right.
I said it the first time. You know what I mean.
You're both very brave for attempting that word. But the social factors are perhaps way more on the actual outcomes. Okay, thank you very much. I'll pass over to Assemblymember Berry now for her line of questioning.
Thank you very much. I think, like the chair has been saying, we've had quite a lot of chat about all of this, and I think we're getting down to some real basic questions now that won't take very long. But I think I'm interested in what you said, Lisa, about there being, within decisions, inclusion would always win out, because I'm not convinced by that. I think, if you look at the London Plan and the various bits of guidance, I think in terms of the weight of words, there's a lot more about inclusion, there's a lot more about active travel and permeability. But in policy D11, it says work with your Metropolitan Police. And I think if you're the planning officer or the planning committee, the police recommending something is a very strong thing. And although you've got lots of words, I don't think there's the strength of the words yet in the London Plan. Are you thinking of doing something about that and stating more clearly how the balance could be struck?
I mean, I'm just trying to find the exact wording, but my recollection it is here we go. It is taking into taking into consideration that advice. I mean, bearing in mind that D11 is just one policy. You've got, the very lengthy policy in D3, which is to do with how you design places, the form, the character, height and massing, all of those issues. You've got a separate policy on public realm. So I think actually in the context of the whole London plan, this section is actually quite small, although it's very, very specific, and it has to be read in the round of those other things. But I would also go back to the good growth objectives. And those are really clear, because I think the way in which you deliver community safety is not a direct equal sign to the advice of a designing out crime officer. So there's other ways of delivering community safety that are to do with building strong and resilient communities. And I think that balance is struck very clearly in the good growth objectives, and that flows throughout the plan, which is that actually building places where communities come together, where people mix, where there's opportunities for mixing. And I think just drawing on things like the healthy streets principles, for example, those are the principles by which our own TfL officers assess planning applications. And that's an absolutely critical, that we have our own crime safety officers that sit within TfL, and they reach a conclusion based both on the advice from the designing out crime officers, but also the colleagues within TfL to find an optimal solution alongside the industry professionals, the architects, etc.
Can you clarify that role? So those are TfL officers who are asked to comment on planning applications, or are you just talking about TfL's own developments?
No, that's TfL officers who comment on planning applications.
So potentially your guidance could give primacy to them, who are also taking into account the comments of the police, rather than saying that the police should be listened to specifically.
Well, they would negotiate alongside. So when a planning application comes in, there would be shared negotiation. So TfL would provide their comments, a designing out crime officer would provide theirs. But I think ultimately we tend to think of planning applications as a design journey. So things get tweaked and changed, and there's negotiations that happen. And I think I wouldn't want to over-represent in some way that designing out crime officers have some control over that process or some primacy in that process. It's a shared process. Everyone goes on that design journey together, including the local planning authority, urban design officers or case officers, to find a kind of optimal solution, of which the advice of a designing out crime officer is very valuable. It helps inform how you reach that decision, but I wouldn't want to suggest that it's given some primacy around all of the other professionals that are at the table, because it's coming from a singular perspective, which is to do with crime, not to do with...
Sure. But I still think that when it comes to individual decisions at a borough level on relatively small things, and often, whether or not there's a nice bench and a tree is part of a very small development, I'm not convinced that it wouldn't be necessarily more weighty for the comments of a police officer to be listened to when they're talking about safety, compared with a transport officer when they're talking about living healthy lives and having a nice street. You know what I mean? I think we need to be clearer in our policy, do we not?
I think we definitely take that away. That's useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair comment, to be honest. But that goes across the entire plan. I mean, I'll give you a non-crime example. The issue we've been having recently about the application of a number of policies, such as dual aspect. We would obviously love every flat in a development to have dual aspect, but it's impossible to design every flat with dual aspect, or it would be so phenomenally expensive you would not see any affordable housing. So again, it's compromises, and then you're into the difficulty of how do you set the standard and encourage the standard, but not have it adhered to slavishly, that then it plays against everything else. And this is another example of that, where we have the police are laying out their standard, we have our standard of public realm. The policy document, the London Plan, obviously also acknowledges the DOCO aspirations. it's then over to the local decision makers, but crucially those people drawing up the local report to come to a balance with the competing priorities. And I think your point is a fair one, but it's not just this alone. It's how does one write a series of benchmarks that you say this is kind of not even gold standard, this is silver plus standard, silver to gold standard. We'd like these policies adhered to, but we don't want you to use them as a tick box exercise that prevents things happening, whether that's preventing the whole development happening or just even preventing good standards of
Sure. I mean, sure, you're still talking very broadly about the principles that are applied throughout every planning. I would say that in terms of the public realm and how we design our public spaces and the spaces around our homes, the weight of words in the London Plan, the guidance, the public London Charter, the whole of that, it's not about crime. You said, these are non-crime policies by and large, and so the idea that there's almost equal weight given to all the other things that are not crime against this one thing, that's the balance I'm seeking to get clarity of in written policy. I'm not saying that planning should be done not as a balance.
The danger of repeating myself, perhaps what Lisa was alluding to. I mean, I do think that there's an awful lot more.
Are you disagreeing? Policy. Are you saying it's perfectly clear right now? Because that's all we're really. Because we're trying to save time. No. Sorry, Jules.
I'm not saying it's clear. I mean, I'm saying, I suppose that it is pretty clear, but that doesn't result in perhaps the right balance in its application, and so we can do more on that.
Thank you. Yeah. That's
so
what
I was agreeing with you in the sense of how it is applied.
Trying to save some time.
But obviously there is infinitely more policy and positive policy about public realm. Much of it does have an impact on crime. Things about like permeability, overlooking, that kind of thing. But it doesn't necessarily mention the crime word. So when you say about the relative weight and balance, there is an awful lot of positive policy that will contribute to crime reduction that could also see better public realm. But I suppose when you're writing a report and you're making a decision at borough level, the police have a certain weight attributed to them that then the decision maker and indeed the report writer will often attribute a greater weight to that. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then I note that your design advocates exist, and one of their parts of their remit is to have debates. And I wondered if they had debated these issues and whether they should be asked to ahead of this time. Obviously, this committee's having a very interesting debate, and we'll make our own recommendations. But that seems like a body you might go to with a specific question too.
I was only going to say specifically around our good growth by design work on violence against women and girls. That's been done completely with mayoral design advocates support as a real resource to help us do that.
That sounds like a really positive thing.
And there will also be things, other discrete bits of work that they have helped on. Things, the one that jumps to mind is the child-friendly city work as well. There would have been elements in that about safety of young people that, again, the MDA's helped on.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll hand back to the chair now, sorry.
Thank you. No, we'll certainly be following up on both of those aspects and more, actually, because the committee is hoping to integrate, I think, a collection of our meetings' work in terms of how we can help contribute to our perspective on improving the London Plan in the next iteration. So thank you for that. Assemblymember Bess, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. As with any of this kind of stuff at this stage, you've gone into the realms of these questions, but just to ask specifically, what mechanisms are in place to ensure meaningful community input on crime prevention strategies within the London Plan?
We've got our overarching Planning for London programme work, and the issues around crime and fear of crime were raised through there. I think, in particular, the young people, some of the schools work that we did in person, and particularly with schools that, for example, had very high pupil premium, for example, there was some real insights there. And again, with the deliberative events, I think maybe it's a surprise, but there wasn't as much crime and safety didn't perhaps come up as much in the kind of discussions with the general public as may have been expected. It wasn't one of the big things that was mentioned, but it would be things like, high streets and town centres, one of the key qualities of them should be they should be safe. But it wasn't something people went into a lot of detail with. And I think the only cohort that we spoke to who were really raised it in quite a meaningful and ongoing way were the children and young people, actually. I know that TfL are doing some work at the moment. They're speaking to 1,000 women to understand their experiences being out and about in London and trying to understand from that particular perspective. And I think as we move forward, we also need to think about some of our conversations and perhaps doing more drill down work, perhaps maybe just women-only groups, for example, to try and understand experiences.
And young people.
And more work with young people.
Can you think of any kind of example of where something that either one of these young people or any other kind of resident group engagement event where something's been said and been actioned, or a review's been made or an evaluation based on that feedback?
Yeah, so some of that feedback, what the examples that I was given was where young people took a site in their local area and they had to design up the site, and then part of the feedback that will go directly into informing the next London plan was their rationale and what they were trying to achieve in terms of that design. So a lot of them were talking about they were trying to sort out, issues that they felt were less safe or that made them feel unsafe in that area, and the design they came up with was specifically focused on addressing those perceived issues with either with adjacent open spaces and play areas, for example. So they might design a mugger or something like that, but part of their rationale, quite a significant part, was to get rid of perceptions of lack of care, but also crime and criminal activity in those locations. So that will directly inform our thinking for the next London plan.
Thanks. And is there any specific initiatives or forums, and obviously you mentioned the TfL initiative, but is there any specific initiatives or forums where that ongoing dialogue can be had with not just the community in the room, but with the stakeholders and architects?
Yeah, I think definitely in our ongoing discussions for the London plan, we've kind of done a phase, but we'll need to be having further phases on that as we go through the London plan process, and we would expect the kind of opportunity for a mixed conversation.
I think there's been so far more than 60 sessions of engagement, but that's really only just the beginning of the process. I mean, this has really just been the informal evidence gathering stage, but obviously evidence will continue to be gathered in the more formal processes that will kick off after the mayoral election. But also the Good Growth by Design team, obviously there's various pieces of work both that have been done, the children's city work, but also the ongoing important piece of work that we've mentioned several times already, which is the women and girls and gender diverse people and public realm work, which is ongoing.
And with those conversations, will there be those stakeholders in the room as well, like the architects, the police, for example, like I've heard today, TfL?
I'm not sure about the police. I mean, there will be crime experts involved. I'd have to get back to you about whether the police were actually involved in what way they were actually involved in that work.
I guess something that we've heard from the first session today is perhaps a perception of a disconnect between the work done by SDB's work and how the community view that work. So would the London plan perhaps be a good opportunity to have more of a discussion or formalised discussion between community groups, young people, and the representatives from the police to kind of find that, because I found it really interesting this morning. You can see where everybody is coming from, and everyone has a legitimate reason for their perception, right? You said, Jules, it's all about perception. So is this a good opportunity to kind of formalise that engagement and kind of understand both sides and see that compromise?
Yeah, just so it's also caught on the transcript in terms of having your mic on, just to, what was your...
Yes, the answer is yes. Both of us agree.
Definitive yes, Chair. Okay, fascinating. Well, thank you, Assembly Best. I mean, I think a lot of the questions have been answered, so I will just wrap us up, really. Sort of, wanting, I think, one specific follow-up, which is, I think, that work that you've talked about, Lisa, in terms of TfL speaking to 1,000 women. Could you just elaborate a little bit more about that? Because I think that's the kind of work that I think we will want to follow up on.
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide more detail
Please.
in writing, and also the interrelationship between that work and the violence against women and girls and gender diverse.
That would be fantastic. And I think I'll just summarise the last sort of question really is, you know, Jules and Lisa, based on what you've heard today, the kind of line of questioning that the committee members have asked, is there anything that you would leave us with in terms of what we might consider with this intersection of planning and crime in terms of how we would contribute to the next London plan?
Yeah, I would just emphasise that I think the Healthy Streets principles are a really sound basis for looking at the spaces between buildings. And I think a lot of the tensions that do arise between different recommendations are usually not to do with the actual internal space. That they're more likely to be to do with how we treat the public realm. So I think that's quite important. And I do think that there's scope for ongoing discussion about what that guidance actually is. And I think I'd come back to the point on permeability and public spaces and feelings of safety, and the importance of us giving the right guidance around that, recognising there is a tension there. And I sat and listened to the first session, and I think it's probably important to recognise that whilst reducing permeability can make it easier to catch people, it probably also makes it feel less safe because there's no way to get out if you're using that space. So I think before we give any further guidance, I think we'd need to resolve those tensions and make sure we could give the right guidance in any changed London plan.
Thank you, Lisa. Did you want to add anything, Jules? Can I just say, you know, I know we sometimes have brought you in as a second part panel only for sort of 45 minutes, and especially on a rail strike day. But I do have to say, other than obviously our sort of statutory duty to scrutinise the work in your portfolio, I find that both your contributions are always incredibly insightful and do help the committee move forward in terms of thinking about our agenda. So I am grateful for your time and your answers today, and the committee does really value having you come and speak to us. Okay, we have now reached the end of the session, and I would like to thank our guests for attending both our second panel and our first panels this morning for your contributions today. We have already delegated authority to me as chair in consultation with group leads to agree any output arising from the discussion earlier, so I'll move on to the next agenda item, which is to agree the work programme. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 2023-2024 Assembly year, please? Thank you. The date of the next committee meeting. The next meeting of the Planning Regeneration Committee will take place on Thursday, the 29th of February at 10 a.m. in the Chamber in City Hall. Any other business? I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Many thanks to the committee members for making it in again on a rail strike day and for everyone's work on today's committee. We have no urgent business. I conclude today's meeting. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.